Hey, May 40 here, back from 3 straight days of Jewish holidays, last 2 days of the Festival of Sukkot, and then it was the Sabbath. Good to be back. I was talking about how dating is different in Australia compared to the United States. So Australian dating tends to be much more low-key. It tends to be much less formal. You don't have as many dramatic announcements such as, oh, I'm in a really serious relationship. People in Australia, generally speaking, are much less likely to boast than Americans. They don't usually talk about, I'm in this really serious relationship where we're now boyfriend, girlfriend, we're now exclusive, we're now engaged. But if you spend a certain amount of time with a bloke, you'll become known as his missus, whether or not you're married. But that's Joe's missus, that's John's missus. People will tend to meet for drinks. Australia is incredibly sexually segregated in the way that it operates on a social scale. So, for example, if you go to a party in America, generally the husband and wife socialize together. And in Australia, generally speaking, the husband and wife socialize separately at a party, all right? The blokes go off with the blokes and the women with the women. So Australian men are less romantic. They're probably less articulate. They are less likely to buy you big gifts. They're less likely to make a big deal out of asking you out. They're more likely to take no for an answer. And this is the Australian Today
Lordy
show.
have done a lot for Australia's tourism, with travellers flocking from all over the world to try and find love down under. Turns out, us fellas are getting a bad rap.
Girls, if you think that Irish men are hard work, go to Australia. You will be crawling back to Ireland to marry an Irish man. Australian men, I don't think they know how to speak to women.
How do people, like, get together here? Because I can't with the standard.
Can someone please explain to me how Australian dating rules work? Because I don't get it. I do not understand. I feel like if you say one wrong thing, you're left on red, and then the amount of dates that have been organised, and then the guy's just never texting me again.
So there are rules for how pretty much everything in life works. And if you don't get the rules, then you have to ask for help, which is another reason why a group strategy, where you're part of a community, where you have a large number of people that you're acquainted with, right, really helps you figure out these otherwise impenetrable maze that whether it's you can't figure out how to work the copier or Microsoft Word or your computer, or what are the dating rules in this particular location.
Has never happened anywhere else in the world. And every woman I speak to has the exact same horror stories about Australian men.
So are Australian men like the world's laziest daters? I think that's a good summary.
It is absolutely brutal, Carlos. Lucky you're not on the market, mate. Jane Amos joins us fresh off her flight back to Scotland, and Sydney columnist Jana Hocking, whose recent article has caused quite a stir. Jane, we want to come to you first. Did you flee the country because of these duds, huh?
Oh, whoa.
Yes, that's what I'm going to tell TikTok for sure.
Was it that bad? I mean, come on.
I went on 6 dates in 3 weeks, and the best one was when I got catfished.
Oh.
Talk to us about that.
He lied about his height, his age, his profession.
Oh, dear.
Yeah, but he was still attractive and he paid for everything. So,
that's a plus.
So what's wrong with you
Yeah,
then?
come on.
I mean, he said he was a semi-professional footballer. And
So Australians tend to be fairly plain-spoken, and it's a lot easier to be plain-spoken in Australia, where you don't have as much litigation, you don't have such low social cohesion and social trust as you have in the United States, right? So when you're among your own, when you feel safe, you're much more likely to speak plainly than when you don't know who you're dealing with.
And he went as far as to name a team. Like, he really... he dove into that lie.
Open to definition, you know, maybe he was.
All right, so you didn't find love, you fled back to Scotland because obviously the Scottish guys are better. No.
Ooh, no, maybe not.
All right, so I mean, you have written a couple of articles about this too.
Yeah.
I mean, what's the problem? Why are Aussie blokes duds?
They're just lazy. Jade got it.
So Steve Saylor made this observation that as you move south in Europe, right, the men become and the women become increasingly prone to promiscuity. So when you go to the north, to Scandinavia, that traditionally these Northern European men would figure that one woman was all they could handle. But then as you steadily move south to France and to Spain and to Italy, adultery becomes increasingly accepted. And then you move to Africa, where just sexual promiscuity is out of control.
Right, the word is lazy.
So Australia was founded largely by Northern Europeans. It's become more diverse. But I think another explanation here for the word lazy is that not terribly articulate or not terribly gifted with deception. So the men who are most successful with women often use a great deal of deception. And men of Northern European origins are less likely to play these elaborate word games and make these elaborate ploys, because in the Northern European worldview, it's basically the one worldview that holds that there's one universal morality. And so when you understand that there's one universal morality, not just for how you treat your in-group, but how you should treat your out-group, there's much less room for creative innovation that enables promiscuity.
Turn up to dates in board shorts. If you turn up to a date, because first they'll ask you, just come to my house and hang. Like, I've never had so many Uber Eats in my life, enough. Or they'll say, come to the pub. And then you'll go to the pub, but they're also watching the NRL or the AFL or the cricket's on. And, like, guys,
They need to step up, right?
we live in Australia.
That a good date, though?
No, that is a horrible
Whatever.
date.
Go out with your bros
We
for that.
live like near beaches. We've got art galleries. We've got,
Who
outdoor
wants to go to an art gallery?
Everybody
Women do.
does.
You're not going to find a real man who wants to do that.
But woo us. Just like, take them.
Yeah. So when American men go over to Australia, or Italian men, or Latin men, they tend to do incredibly well because Australian women are not used to being romanced so intensely and creatively.
Mickey and woo us for the first.
All right, well,
3
you
days.
must have a to-do list then, Jana. What should men be doing?
Men should be wearing cologne, checking your breath. I hate that I have to say, brush your teeth.
It's so obvious.
Men, brush your teeth. Like, the halitosis is real at the moment.
Chewy or a mint or something in
Just
your
a
pocket.
little Listerine.
Yeah.
That's
So
all
maybe
we
you're
ask.
just off
remember
blokes
those?
in general.
No, oh no. No. Ask all my friends. I'm boy crazy. I'm on.
Okay, so the woman who is commenting here is in her 30s. So normally in Australia, you pair up in high school or soon after, and then you marry your high school sweetheart, and it's a lot easier to do that, right? Because you've known someone for a long time, you're more likely to know their family, and you're more likely to have a good read on them. But that's the way it was in Australia. Now people in Australia, if they get married at all, it's often in their 30s and 40s, and it's with people that they didn't go to school with. And so there are a lot more unpredictable things that are going to pop up, and it's a lot harder to make connections and to settle down and get married, particularly as a woman. When you move into your 30s, you're going to be most eligible. You're going to be at your height of your physical attractiveness around age 18.
Of Aussie blokes, because I just got back from New York, and those men have game. They treat it like a numbers game. They go to brunch because they know all the women are
Yeah, but you
there.
don't know if the blokes in America are more into blokes or themselves than girls.
Oh, you think they're too
they
pretty?
just put it on.
Well, I don't care. Put it on me.
Whatever works.
I am like here for the taking. I went through security at JFK, and the security guy cracked onto me, and I was like,
Yeah, you're
I've
right.
Still got it. Oh, yeah.
I've arrived.
Jade, I mean, do you still hold out some kind of hope?
Yeah, and I suspect that security guard, I'm just going to guess, was black, who people tend to be more outgoing, much more free with compliments. And I think she may have been flattered by him asking her out, but did she actually take him up on it?
Finding a dude down under, or what? Is it all over?
Just giving up.
Oh, I think before, if I'd met an Australian in the UK, I would have flocked to him. And now, honestly, I'm going to take a wide berth. That accent's not going to do it for me anymore, I'm afraid.
Oh, wow. Aussie men, you've been warned.
But come on, I mean, maybe it's... I mean, could it be that your expectations are too high? I mean, could it be that you're raising
Please,
the bar?
Carlos, honestly.
No, do you know what? I got so many essays about this after I wrote that article going, men, lift your game. You've gotten really lazy. Like, I've had guys drop farts on dates. I've had guys turn up in ripped boardies, in thongs.
All right.
Is it too much to ask to just take us for a nice drink?
The thing is, all of that can come, but just not early. Let's just
But I
throw it
also
all
don't
out
want to be
early.
invited to your house for Netflix and chill.
So Kathy Sipe, my late friend who died in 2007 of lung cancer, but we were close between 2002 and 2007. She once wrote, Luke is a womanizer, but a very lazy womanizer. And I'm just starting to think, as I recollect about Australian dating habits, maybe I've internalized the lazy dating strategies of the Aussie male. And my subject question is, are Australian men the laziest daters in the world? So we've got Jewel Nichols writing here. Why are Aussie men so afraid to summon some sort of compliment? They're just straight up laziness. This laziness permeates Australian dating culture in general, from organizing dates to texting back. And then she complains that they will F you innumerable times, but they won't give you head. They'll roll over and text other girls while you're still naked in their bed. Right, I think this says a great deal about her, that someone would do this. Australian men suck at love bombing. Well, love bombing is a type of deception. It's usually a sign that you're dealing with a psychopath. In Europe, when men love bomb, at least you get a trip out of Italy, a trip to Italy out of it. Okay, I think there's something seriously messed up with this woman. Here, they buy you the ugliest flowers you've ever seen, and then they eventually give you chlamydia. And the men in Australia who don't love bomb you are boring. They take you on 5 dates to mediocre restaurants and lame dive bars, then tell you that they don't have time to date, even though they work part-time and their only hobby is indoor rock climbing. And looking at a thread on Reddit, older generations put in more effort. They would buy their partners gifts. The younger ones seem to be very low effort, don't know how to cook or to be romantic. I'm always giving my guy friends advice on gifts. 2 Australian men I had serious relationships were low effort. One always had me pay for everything with an excuse as to why he couldn't. The other one never wanted to go anywhere or do anything that required him to dress more nicely than a pair of trackies and joggers. Going out was always takeout. Another thread here on Reddit. First thing to say, I've been in Australia for 7 years. I'm English male, naturalized Australian, married to an Aussie with Aussie kids. I find Aussie men, on the whole, quite difficult to engage in conversation because they don't seem to ask any questions. Yeah, Australians tend to be quite reticent. They're happy to talk, but I'm usually doing the heavy lifting in a conversation. If I don't ask questions, the conversations grind to a halt. This is true with a lot of Aussie men. Aussie girl, up. Yes, this applies to a large proportion of Aussie guys. I'm a good conversationalist, but I have to ask all the questions, I have to do all the prompting. Otherwise, the conversation will grind to an awkward halt. That's not because they don't want to talk more. It's just that they don't seem to know how to keep a conversation flowing, at least with the girl and the hot topics that I want to talk about. And like says, it's because we worry it might turn to cricket, and we'd have to put up with being told that valid dismissals are not out, that we are morally corrupt, and that we must play within England's spirit of cricket as it suits them on the given day, and that our wins are actually possible. Folks in Australia are a bit stuck in the 1980s, and the only acceptable topic of conversation is sports stars and how drunk you got last night. Everything else was pretty. Another thread, this is on Quora. Australian men are less likely to utter meaningless pleasantries. That's true of Australian women as well, but they are more likely to thank somebody, even if it's just for doing their job. Australian men don't tend to talk about their feelings. On other subjects, they tend to be open and honest. Never ask for an opinion unless you want brutal honesty. The language is colorful. Swearing is part of the vocabulary. So, yeah, Australians swear much more than Americans. Aussies, we use a lot of insults in jest and in friendship. We don't set out to be offensive, but we also don't care if we are. So Aussies will often be seen as disrespectful or overly familiar. Australians cannot tolerate the concept of class or status. If people are doing menial or thankless jobs, they are generally afforded more respect by their fellow Aussies than executives. Aussies are often perceived as racist because we are carefree in our language. We have no time for political correctness. Australians don't like whingers. The quickest way to incur the wrath of an Australian is unjustified whinging. So one way of understanding whinging, meaning complaining, is it's an expression of emotion. And Australian men in particular tend to be quite buttoned up with regard to emotion. When dating an Australian, it's best to permit swearing in the conversation. If you try to amend this, you'll cop slam doors, boiled up rage. Never ever assume we lack culture or that we are uncouth. We solve problems quickly. Airy, fairy talk will make you unpopular. Be direct, upfront. Do not hesitate to say, I stuffed up, meaning I made a mistake. We despise people who protect their ego at all costs by pretending not to be in the wrong. Aussies tend to be socially easygoing. Our demeanor is social, light, optimistic. We're not in a rush. We do not tend to have long, deep conversations without having a lot of sarcastic and humorous interjections. 10 ways to know if someone likes you here. I think this doesn't just apply in Australia, but also around the world. If someone talks to you a lot, they're always hanging around you. If they compliment and insult you, great deal. If they have a goofy grin on their face when they look at you, if they do nice things for you, if they find excuses to stay in touch, they touch you when they're talking to you to emphasize a point, they smile or frown at you a lot, meaning you have an emotional impact on them. They laugh at all your jokes, even the bad ones. They kiss you. And they confide in things. So here are 10 signs that you are dating an Aussie man.
Event over here. So if you're dating an Aussie and they don't go out of their way when your anniversary comes, don't be offended, guys. It's just the way that this culture is. Overall, anniversaries and big, huge, cliche romantic celebrations just aren't an event where people go overboard to celebrate. The second thing on this list is gift giving. And obviously, if you've read like the 5 love languages and your partner's love language is gift giving, then this probably isn't going to actually fall under that category. But overall, Australian men just don't seem as materialistic as their American counterparts. Obviously, if you're buying your partner like a $40,000 car or a $10,000 holiday, I'm sure they're going to be ecstatic and truly appreciate something like that. But when it comes to smaller, typical gifts, overall, Aussie men really couldn't care less for the most part. A lot of Aussies really aren't the materialistic types. So while a lot of men do put thought into gifts for something like Christmas or for birthdays, typically don't expect gifts to be given a lot, don't expect big, huge gifts for things like anniversaries.
Okay, I heard my audio was fuzzing. How is it now?
And Valentine's Day and whatnot. Mother's Day, you might get a bunch of flowers or you might get a cute little gift from the kids when they're like 1 or 2 and can't actually pick anything out yet. But overall, materialistic gifts aren't a big thing over here. If your partner is into gift giving or they do find something special that did remind them of you, then they might pick something like that up, but don't expect a lot of gifts all the time. Even when you're in the early stages, even when you are dating. And this one comes with the culture, and this one really comes down to Aussie men and Aussie women because I have friends who are both. And overall, don't expect those long, drawn-out, deep philosophical conversations, those long walks on the beach talking about the meaning of life and if aliens exist and whatnot. Yeah, of course, Aussie men are capable of having deep conversations, but Australians have such a sense of humor that it's not going to be this long, serious conversation. You're going to be laughing. You're going to be cracking up probably. And I know a lot of Aussies who use humor as a way.
So for Americans, humor has its place, and it's usually somewhat demarcated. But for Australians and for the English, they will interject humor into all of life. All right, what are the odds that Trump wins the election? I would say 75-25, so probably 3-1. I suspect that Trump will win over Kamala Harris. All right, here is Kamala Harris's leading polling expert.
It used to be, Dan, when we and I started our youth, that we had a rule of thumb that the greater the turnout, the better it was for Democrats or liberals, because young people tended to be a little bit more left-leaning. They were the ones that were more that were a little bit iffier on voting regularly, while older people who tended to be a little bit more conservative would be, I'll vote hell or high water. That has changed now. It's no longer the sense that a high turnout necessarily means good for the liberals, because now with Trump, he brought out a group of new voters back in 2016 that normally would not have voted. And the question we're facing now in 2024 is, are the people that, Trump's focusing on kind of, maybe young men that have not voted before, will they get off the couch and vote for him? Similarly, will some of the people that are normally, constituencies of the Democrats come out and vote? So, it may be that in this election.
So we have all these articles now in the New York Times and the New Yorker. What's the matter with young male voters? If Kamala Harris loses the election to Donald Trump, disaffected young men will inevitably shoulder much of the blame. So what's wrong with young men? You've got many liberal outlets puzzling over polling results that show young men between the ages of 18 and 29 are leaving the Democratic Party, and they are expected to be reliable Democratic votes. So if Harris loses to Donald Trump, we will hear that young disaffected men will become the focus of a great deal of bewilderment and hand-wringing. And the author here, this is quite a fair piece in the New Yorker. I find this framing annoying and incurious because it starts with an assumption that any veering from the liberal coastal consensus must be the result of some underlying dysfunction, brainwashing, or coercion. So in these moments, the liberal commentariat sounds distraught. They sound like absentee parents who, upon discovering a stash of marijuana or pornography in their child's room, march them straight to a therapist to figure out what went wrong. So in San Francisco, there is ample evidence that Asian American voters, who make up a third of the electorate, are trending right. And there are simple explanations for this. Progressive, equity-driven school policies and an insufficient response to a rash of horrific hate crimes convinced many Asian American voters that the Democratic Party was not looking out for their interests. And many young men experience our society as one big, HR nightmare, where there are more and more restrictions on simply acting and speaking like a typical bloke. Right? So I agree with the author here. We shouldn't accuse people of being stupid. We should look for understanding, why are these voters acting rationally, not looking for why they're under the spell of disinformation or whatever magical liberal excuse might be for the failure to reach beyond their core demographics. So on Monday, the New York Times published a long opinion piece by the director of polling at the Harvard Kennedy School Institute of Politics titled "Trump's Bro Whispering Could Cost Democrats Too Many Young Men." And one of the theses behind this article was that Donald Trump was appealing to young men by going on bro podcasts, and that simply going on these podcasts, he was hoodwinking young men against following their best interests. Today's young men, according to this pollster, are lonely, increasingly single, and depressed. Nearly 3/4 of Gen Z men report feeling regularly stressed by an uncertain future, stirring painful memories of the Great Recession they witnessed as children. Well, who controls most of the institutions in this country? All right, the center-left and the left controls most of the institutions. So young men might very well have some rational reasons for why they are anti-establishment. So from the liberal perspective, Donald Trump has been conducting a master class in bro whispering, but Trump is appealing to real concerns that young men have about a society that seems increasingly hostile to normal expressions of masculinity. If young men are feeling bleak about their future, right, they probably need a job that gives them a sense of purpose, one that connects them with people in their community. Now, is it Trump's bro-centric media strategy that is getting all this support from men? Do Democrats need to pander more to TikTok influencers or people like Andrew Tate? Well, probably not. Right? Kamala Harris could be a weekly guest on the Joe Rogan show, and the vast majority of these drifting young men would remain unconvinced that liberal elite America has much to offer them. What does the Democratic Party offer these disaffected young men? You can say better access to healthcare, stronger social safety net, better schools and public services, but none of these have been at the center of Democratic messaging for the past 10 years. Said what these young men hear about is that Donald Trump is a fascist and he poses a threat to something called democracy. And if you don't want to see America fall into democracy, they must vote Democrat no matter who is at the top of the ticket. And Obama would lecture young black men saying, what's wrong with you? You're just afraid of voting for a woman. And so young men in general, whether they're black, brown, white, they realize that if they stray from the center left, they will be castigated as bigots or naive idiots who are risking the lives of everyone in the country. They are the joker electorate. Supposedly, they just want to watch the establishment burn. So young people are particularly attuned to hypocrisies, which picks up their desire to rage against the machine. And they understand that most of our institutions are run by people on the left, and they are sick of it. Right? The Democratic Party has now spent a decade trashing its Bernie Sanders populist wing. And so Republicans currently have an electoral monopoly on anti-establishment rhetoric. And it's hard to see anything loosening that hold. Republicans are the party for people who want to say what they think, to point out hypocrisy, and not worry about things like Social Security and healthcare. Where do these young men go now? Will they really come back to the Democratic fold? Right? Not much evidence for that right now.
A higher turnout does not necessarily mean good things for the Democrats, and it may be that some of the people.
Right. This is a huge change in the established wisdom. So for the past 60 years, high turnout was great for Democrats. Now, the higher the turnout, the better it is for Donald Trump.
Who are leaning Trump end up staying home themselves. That's why it's such a question mark right now. The whole game comes out to turnout, and the turnout skew could go either direction.
Yeah, I think it feels like a lot of people, not you guys who have the actual data, but the people who sort of analyze the election or maybe on the periphery of the efforts to elect Harris or defeat Trump, really just like, this is like 2020, it's like 2020, it's going to be just like 2020, and whether can she get Biden's numbers with Latinos in order to, if she falls by 1 point, where she can get that other point because it's so close. But it seems very possible this election could end up looking very different than 2020, right? It's just in terms of turnout and composition. How are you guys thinking about that?
Yeah, no, it's clear. I mean, there's some polls would indicate that the proportion of younger Black and Latino men may not be this. Harris may not reach the benchmarks that Biden got with them, but there are also indications that Harris is doing better with Republicans, with some cohort of Republicans. I mean, she campaigns with Liz Cheney and has significant Republican support. So the question mark, will it be like a little 5%, 7%, 9%, 10% of Republicans that cross over and vote for Harris that would mitigate what small losses she could get with some of the younger men, both white men and men of Latino men. I think the concern about Black voters not.
Before Biden got out of the race, his erosion with both Black and Latino voters meant that
And this is Ronald Brownstein.
He was in a very difficult position across the Sun Belt battlegrounds. But the fact that his support was largely holding from what he won in 2020 meant that paradoxically he was in a relatively better position in the states that were more white, less diverse, and older in the Rust Belt, right? The 3 states that fell out of what I once called the Blue Wall, which we'll talk about in a bit. Harris comes in the race, and Harris, regained a lot of the ground that Biden lost with Black and Latino voters. But I think it's pretty clear in the final weeks that she hasn't regained all of it and is not likely to regain all of it. It's almost an impossible mission to regain all of it, given how many voters in those communities do live paycheck to paycheck, kind of at the economic margin, and feel like they were better off under Trump. I remember writing way back, that if every Latino voter who said they were better off under Trump voted for him, it would be really difficult for Democrats in states where there are a lot of those voters. Harris is, as I said, much more competitive than Biden in the Sun Belt swing states, Georgia, North Carolina, Arizona, and Nevada. But it's not 100% clear that she can be competitive enough to actually tip any of them back in her direction, which means that her most plausible.
Wow, if she doesn't win the Rust Belt states, how on earth does she win? Right, how's my audio quality now?
Pathway, and it is still a plausible pathway to winning, is to sweep Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. I mean, I kind of feel like we're ending up back in a place where we started the year, where it is essentially her ability to knit together just enough, hold enough of the large urban centers that are heavily minority, Philadelphia, Detroit, Milwaukee, hold down her losses in the mid-sized cities, the Eries and Scrantons and Green Bays and Racine's, Saginaw, and then blow off the doors in the white-collar, well-educated inner suburbs, Oakland, Chester. Trump has clearly, energized a lot of non-habitual, blue-collar, non-urban voters in these states, but he has moved these white-collar suburbs further toward the Democrats, and I would not be surprised if Harris wins most, if not all of them, by even more than Biden did. I mean, based on my reporting from being out in Oakland County last weekend. I mean, the issue is this pincer movement that she faces in these states. On the one hand.
Okay, the chat says, pity there's no Luke and Friends live chats where we can ask him questions outside his list of topics. Look, I'll try to respond to all the questions in the chat. Will Luke date a cute, slowly aging late 30s woman? Sure. I would date a woman my age and younger. It would depend on the quality of the woman. There are amazing women in their 50s.
And she's a woman of color who they have successfully painted as a cultural liberal.
What happens when I double my intake of beak organ capsules? I haven't tried that.
With all these attacks on transgender issues and elsewhere. So it wouldn't be shocking to me that if Trump ran even better in the small town, exurban, rural parts of Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin than he did in 2020. And we'll have to see how much, but it looks like there could be some cracking in those central cities of Milwaukee, Philadelphia, Detroit. Maybe not as much as we're seeing in national polls, but probably something, given the frustration about the economy, particularly among Black men. And so where does that leave you? That leaves you that she probably has to run even better than Biden did in the white collar inner suburbs. But that is totally within her reach to do. I mean, that is totally possible for her to do. She probably.
So Donald Trump is steadily dropping among white voters over the past 3 elections. And white voters are the one demographic group that the Trump campaign refuses to explicitly target message towards.
She has to do it, but she can do it. No guarantee, but it's there. There's still that path, seems to me, very viable for her to win those states, which would take her exactly to 270.
I mean, it is interesting that Trump has changed the makeup of the parties, but what he has done is for the Republicans, he has swapped high propensity people who vote in every single election, midterm special elections, for lower propensity voters who have not turned out other than the 2 times Trump was elected.
Totally correct. Absolutely. And you know, look, we know from 2016 and 2020 that Trump's superpower politically is his ability to turn out low propensity, non-college white voters, right? He's done that very well twice. We don't know yet whether that's going to translate into the same ability to turn out low propensity, non-college, non-white voters. Because in polling, consistently, his strength, I think this is less true in the Latino community, but certainly in the black community,
Did I watch the Joe Rogan podcast with Donald Trump? No. I appreciate that Donald Trump is less inhibited than the average politician, but I wouldn't spend my time listening to Trump. I'll listen to highlights. And yes, I do not have a high opinion of Joe Rogan. And from what I've read, he did not ask high quality questions.
His incremental gains from 2020 are primarily among low propensity voters, young men, right, who really don't vote. By the way, every demographic group you can think of, turnout rates are higher for women than for men. Like, we're talking about Latinos.
Right. So Kamala Harris has a big advantage among women, and they are much more likely to turn out than men. So Donald Trump is basing his appeal, his electoral prospects in large part on men who rarely turn out, while Kamala Harris is basing her prospects on women who much more reliably turn out. So that's a good argument for a Kamala Harris victory.
Or black voters or young voters, especially young voters. Young voters, the turnout gap is wider along lines of gender than it is for older voters. So, obviously Democrats are nervous about what they are seeing in the national polls, and they should be. I mean, by historic standards, if she wins by a point or two, traditionally that would not be enough to overcome the fact that the swing states are generally slightly to the right of the country. But that's a little scramble this year, because the swing states she has to win are 80 to 90% white. And her vote, like Biden's, is holding up more among white voters than among non-white voters. So, I can see how Georgia and North Carolina can get more complicated if Trump really improves 5, 6, 7 points among black men. But black men are 5% or less of the electorate in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. I mean, college white women are 3 to 4 times as much of the vote in those states as black men. So, if we're talking about, college white women were somewhere between 15 to 18% of the vote in each of them. Harris's strategy that is aimed so clearly at those white collar suburbs, including vote.
So in the 2018 election, the Republican vote dropped 2% in the suburbs, and it maintained that drop in the 2020 election compared to 2016. So this is the danger area for Donald Trump, right? White suburban voters.
Voters who previously had voted mostly Republican.
Yeah, let's talk about that, because she has spent much of last week campaigning with Liz Cheney. She has ads up with featuring Trump administration former advisors who are attacking Trump. She made a big deal about Trump's fascism comments. I assume you see all of that seems to be directly targeted at this group of voters.
Yeah, totally. Right? I mean, look, there's this. First, by the way, the other to button up the point, the blue collar white share of the vote is going down in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, as it is everywhere else, but it is still higher than it is nationally, considerably higher, right? So, as a share of eligible voters, the blue collar whites are now down to about 50%, just over 50 in Michigan and Pennsylvania, and they're these 3 states, because it seems to me that.
Yeah, if Kamala doesn't win Georgia or North Carolina or Pennsylvania, I don't see how she can win this election.
There is a big fall off. Maybe Georgia is still within reach for her, but I think these 3 states are much more plausible than any of the Sun Belt states, with the possible exception of Georgia staying close. But the other thing that's characteristic about the Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin is that they do have a lot of mid-sized cities, like smaller cities, the Erie, Scranton, Eau Claire, et cetera.
These demographic changes, the way the coalitions have shifted, that explains Harris's strategy. It also sort of explains.
Okay, let's get a burst here. This is John Podhoretz.
The trajectory of the race has been unchanged, but rather that it has changed and shifted in Trump's favor. He has gained 3 points on her.
All right, this was released Friday.
In the poll. They are now tied in a national poll, right, of Times Siena. So articles in Axios, elsewhere, what we are hearing is Democratic liberal panic. And for the first time, I don't believe in political panic. I think it's a stupid way of relating to politics. Everything can change in an afternoon. But there's just no arguing with the fact that the data are shifting in Trump's direction, and Democrats can no longer put their heads in the sand and pretend that it's not happening.
Okay, there are a few polls that show a change in direction back towards Kamala Harris that have been released in the last 48 hours.
It's just not one poll, right?
Well, that's why. Exactly.
It's all the polls show a direction toward Trump, whether it's the Wall Street Journal poll the other day, which showed him ahead and probably his best poll ever in 9 years, or whether it was the CNBC poll, name your poll, and you see Trump closing in the final weeks of the election. And that is not a good sign for the Harris campaign. And it's also, I think, speaks to kind of the muddle, semi-phoniness of her strategy. You know, we had Joy, then we had Kamala had a plan for the housing and for kids. Then we had Trump is too old. Now Trump is the oldest presidential candidate ever. Then we had Trump is hiding. Why won't Trump release his medical records? I'm Kamala Harris.
A Trump Tower interview with the former president, which we aired last Sunday, sparked an explosion of coverage. From the New York Times and Washington Post to Rolling Stone and The Daily Show, Donald Trump was fully engaged. He didn't look tired to me. But some anchors, along with Trump's media detractors, are using it as ammunition.
One of the things that strongman leaders do when they do get control of a country is they shut down independent media.
You say CBS should lose its license. Why? Sure. Well, I've never seen anything like it.
But here are the comments that made the most news.
The enemy within is a pretty ominous phrase if you're talking about other Americans.
These are bad people. We have a lot of bad people. But when you look at Shifty Schiff and some of the others, yeah, they are, to me, the enemy from within. I think Nancy Pelosi is an enemy from within.
And then Howie Kurtz said, well, will you at least say you're not going to punish or prosecute your political opponents? Trump replied, excuse me? That's what they're doing to me.
He said what he meant. He meant what he said.
Laura Ingraham did it last week. Howard Kurtz did it this week. They want him to clean up this enemy within, and he will not do it. Nope, not going to do it.
Don't ever forget what they did to anyone during the pandemic who dared to question their BS policies and their lies. So save your outrage. Trump calling Pelosi and Schiff the enemy within is peanuts compared to calling tens of millions of Americans the enemy from within.
Look, on one question after another, Donald Trump stood his ground. That's his style, whether you agree with what he said or not. He knew what he was doing and then told me he had fun. I'm Howard Kurtz, and this is Media Buzz.
So, yeah, Trump did 3 hours of Joe Rogan. It's hard to see that he was particularly tired. I mean, he didn't look tired or exhausted there. He came across fairly well.
For 9 years now, some in the media have slammed Donald Trump as a would-be dictator and authoritarian, comparing him to Hitler, Stalin, or Mussolini. Much of this has been reported, particularly in The Atlantic. But now John Kelly, Trump's second chief of staff, has gone public in a series of recorded interviews with the New York Times. Retired general says Trump meets the definition of a fascist and has referred to fallen soldiers or wounded soldiers as losers and suckers. And there was this, saying that Trump wanted his generals as loyal as those of the Nazi leader, triggering a media uproar.
He commented more than once that, that Hitler did some good things too.
Trump called John Kelly a lowlife, a liar, and a bully.
And he's a whack job, total whack job. When you fire people for doing a bad job, they get a little bit angry. But he was a nut job to start off with.
But Kelly's words gave an opening to Kamala Harris, who read reporters a statement and took no questions.
It is deeply troubling and incredibly dangerous that Donald Trump would invoke Adolf Hitler, the man who is responsible for the deaths of 6 million Jews.
Do you think Donald Trump is a fascist?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do.
After Trump survived 2 assassination attempts, Democrats are calling him Hitler.
This is about Kamala Harris and a Donald Trump who has so alarmed 4-star generals, so alarmed people whose job is to protect America that they are breaking precedent and coming out and saying Donald Trump is a danger.
The reason Democrats are freaking out about it right now is because what they have learned is that it's not Republicans who are the Hitlers or the Nazis. It's actually emanating from within their own party.
The other thing I think you have to remember about General Kelly is talk to people who've known him, worked with him. You can take his word to the bank.
Joining us now to analyze the coverage in Nashville, Clay Travis, the founder of Outkick and a syndicated radio host. In general, that Hitler did some good things too.
Because Democrats probably got to him and decided we're going to run the same playbook we've been running for 9 years against Donald Trump. They wanted an October surprise, and this is their October surprise. Oh, by the way, it's the same surprise they've been giving for 9 straight years. I think, frankly, it reflects the desperation of the common.
Yeah, a great comment in the chat for all these people who called Donald Trump a fascist. All right, they should be asked to define fascism, because the people who call Donald Trump a fascist are almost never themselves experts in fascism. They're just thinking of the nastiest words that they can use to someone who they think will have a perverse attitude towards the exercise of power, and so they call it fascism. All right, Michael Tracey here talking with Richard Hanania.
If you were being asked in a CNN town hall, what is your greatest weakness? Because here's what I would have said. My greatest weakness or my greatest flaw is that I'm just too gorgeous. It's distracting for people. When I enter into a room, I radiate such beauty that it just dominates the entire dynamic of the room, and then everybody gets sidetracked from the main task that they were going to be focusing on.
Yeah, well,
that's like my question when I watched it. I don't know if you saw that clip. Was like, how couldn't Kamala just like make a joke out of the question, as Trump would have done, no doubt.
I didn't see the clip. What happened?
Oh, so it's Kamala Harris. You may have heard of her.
Uh-huh.
She did a CNN town hall last night, and one of the final questions was one of these seemingly more.
But yes, we needed another guy's like, you're not allowed to take a position while on duty. And so they were there lobbying us in person. I was like, I voted no on that. I got to vote no on rent control, which was very exciting for me. I got to vote yes on locking up shoplifters and so forth. I got to vote no on what else was there? I abolished affirmative action a few years ago. I helped abolish it. But there was just a bunch of tax stuff. They're funny, these initiatives. They're like, you don't know like any.
For example, Israel and the Middle East. But even on Israel, I just find the activist approach to Israel off-putting for the most part, where they just run around shrieking genocide, and it doesn't really lend itself to a more reasoned interrogation of the issue at hand.
Yeah.
So although, for example, in this election cycle, a couple of Democratic incumbents got ousted in large part because pro-Israel groups, such as AIPAC, got involved in their primaries, I couldn't be that devastated at them losing, because I thought that the way that they generally handled the issue of Israel was just so shrill and kind of emotionally manipulative that didn't lend itself to a rational critique that I think is necessary. So I acknowledge I'm hard to please. I'm not saying that everybody else needs to share my perspective on how or whom to vote for, but, for the most part, it would come down.
Believe the stories in the Atlantic about Hitler. What do you think of that? Are you with the MAGAs who say they're just making it up?
Well, the John Kelly stuff, that's from his mouth. So
yeah, right. Well, the other ones are from people. Like, I don't think the Atlantic is making up sources when they say 10 administration officials or whatever. I don't think they're making those up. So yeah, you have John Kelly who's on the record. You have like
Trump, and Trump was complaining about the lack of loyalty amongst his subordinates, and was saying something to the effect of, I need military subordinates who are as loyal as Hitler's subordinates were to Hitler. So John Kelly, or he needs let me rephrase that. Trump was saying he needs military subordinates who are as loyal to him as the German generals are, like kind of a vague historical reference. And then John Kelly went through, do you mean in the Weimar period?
Yeah. I mean, that's the exact story of the Atlantic. Yeah, so you heard it too.
So, I mean, the context was, I think, just kind of Trump grousing. I don't think it was Trump. I mean, the fallacy in the liberal depictions of this is, when I first heard the story and when I'm hearing this version of it now, I never had the slightest notion that Trump was actually trying to signal any kind of affinity for Hitler or Nazism.
But I think this guy, there's a pattern where, like, if he talks about Kim Jong-un or Putin, like, his eyes light up. I mean, there is a pattern. Like, he could say, I want, generals to be loyal, like, Ulysses S. Grant, Abraham Lincoln or something. He could have had, like, some other historical example. But when he wants someone who's, like, tough and cool, he always goes to some authoritarian. I mean, I think that's, I don't think it's, like, anything beyond like that. Like, he always has this thing, like, oh, me and Kim, he sends me beautiful letters, me and she, great buddies. Putin, I get along.
RFK Jr. could get some obscure panel in the Food and Drug Administration that he recommend staff for. I'll see. I don't know. I mean, maybe.
Yeah, and Randall Sawyer says no. He's saying transition team.
I think I just don't. This idea that Trump is this like earth-shattering new coalition. That's a way for people who want to vote for the Republican nominee to do so under the perceived auspices of like combating the so-called establishment. That's why I've been focused on RFK Jr. lately with the article that I published, because his function now is basically to give license to people to vote for one of the two duopoly parties, as RFK Jr. once put it. But I think that by doing so, they're really sticking it to the establishment or deep state or military-industrial complex, which I find to be a total farce.
Yeah, I think there's, I agree with sort of the centrist critique of Trump, like the centrist critique, right? Like that he just doesn't care about democracy. He'll tell people to overthrow, to investigate his enemies. I think that's a real concern. I mean, he basically was. I think a lot of these guys were saying he was basically saying investigate my enemies, and they wouldn't do it, right? And then he would end up firing them all or getting new guys. And so this is going to be something that's
the only person in America who has fought with other people online about what you argue is the genuine menace of January 6th, who then went on to vote for Trump.
Am I the only one who does that? Yeah. No, who else is who we should all respect for this? Ben Shapiro. Ben Shapiro actually believes that Trump tried to overthrow the government on January 6th.
Right. Well, I think January 6th was horrible. And I think Donald Trump's behavior after he clearly lost the 2020 election was horrible. But on a scale of 1 to 10, where 10 is a 9/11 style catastrophe, I'd put 9/11 as a 2. And so it's not the only thing. For me, crime and illegal immigration and an America First foreign policy, these are more important things than January 6th.
Capable of sort of being diplomatic. Yeah, I think Ben Shapiro's heart, knows nothing has changed since January 6th. Kudos to him for not lying, or just trying to pretend like it didn't happen. I think his argument is that basically the guardrails held, and he said at some point the founders designed the system to get around him.
There was never a possibility that the guardrails would not hold on January 6th. There was never a possibility that this was a serious coup. That's why, to me, it was only a 2 out of 10 in severity.
And like Trump. So I think me and Ben Shapiro are sort of in a class of our own as far as this kind of cynicism about him.
But it's bizarre to say that if a president needs to be constrained by guardrails, that you would then vote to re-empower the president.
Well, I think he thinks he'll do good stuff on policy. He'll appoint these judges and these, government officials and so forth. But then he'll be like, oh, lock up all my enemies too, and ignore the election and install me as president forever. And then on that, everyone will ignore him. I think that's the
okay, so you and I have debated in the past, because I actually don't have such a dire view of January.
It's not just January 6th. No, it's the election to January 6th.
The entire post-2020 election, escapade.
Okay, who is Trump going to appoint? Let's get to that.
Frantically denied, and then he eventually confirmed it. But that was initially in NBC. So yeah,
oh man, this is gonna be wild. Who's this guy gonna appoint? How is he gonna be able to appoint people who don't end up hating his guts? What is it, 40 out of 43 or 43 out of 46 or something of the people who Trump appointed in his cabinet, I think it was, ended up opposing him, not supporting him this time. Is that do you think that's gonna repeat? Do you think in 4 years from now, if he wins, all his cabinet officials are gonna dislike him, or has he figured this out?
I think what's highly notable is that what seems like the only senior level cabinet appointee whom Trump never had a petulant falling out with is Mike Pompeo.
Right. Yeah.
And Mike Pompeo's right back in the fold now. Trump was just on the Hugh Hewitt show this morning.
Yeah.
Hugh Hewitt was saying, I know some people on your short list for Secretary of Defense, because I guess now Mike Pompeo is going to go for the trifecta from CIA Director to Secretary of State to Secretary of Defense. And so he named Tom Cotton, Mike Pompeo, and Mike Waltz, who's a very hard-line interventionist congressman from Florida. And Trump said, yeah, those are all people that are on.
Yeah, I think if he would have said Ronald McDonald, I think Trump would have said, yeah. I think Hugh Hewitt really sort of wish casting maybe a little bit. But no, I'm not disagreeing with you. I don't think what Trump says means anything, but I wouldn't be surprised about George W. Bush. Let's blow up Iraq as long as they have democracy. That's all that matters.
Yeah, I'm not saying it has to be a binary litmus test. I'm just saying that if people believe what the common conception is of January 6th among the kind of more liberal intelligentsia or have the Liz Cheney view, which I don't. I mean, just to, again, be clear,
Donald Trump overwhelmingly governed like any other Republican president, with the exception of being more supportive of protectionist trade policy, and he didn't get us into any new wars. So he was less interventionist overseas. He was more protectionist with regard to trade policy, and he went to great efforts to stem the tide of immigration, including refugee intake.
Never shared that view.
Yeah.
But if you had that view and you thought that the United States was teetering on the brink of collapse because Trump tried to stage a literal coup and overturn the constitutional order.
Yeah, I mean, the time to oppose him.
How that couldn't rise to the level of a litmus test. What was that?
What was the last thing you said?
What would rise to the level of importance of becoming a binary litmus test, if not that, if that's what you believed?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it doesn't. I don't know if there is one, aside from something like kill everyone or something like that. Nothing is that. A few things that we debate are that it's a sort of total of policies and personnel and the coalition. See, I think the person at the top is not necessarily that important. I mean, I think that Trump and Ted Cruz and DeSantis basically appoint most of the same people, despite what these people think about RFK being, a huge player in the government. I think Kamala Harris and Biden and maybe Elizabeth Warren appoints more lefty people, but basically they appoint most of the same people. They appoint the same judges. When Trump tried to overthrow the election, I think he should have been convicted. I mean, I think that, it's a funny thing that McConnell at the time said he could have tried to whip the votes, but he didn't. And he ended up, I think, 6 or 7 Republicans voted to convict him after January 6th. I think that was the right thing to do. But yeah, democracy sucks. Economic statism sucks. They both suck. I think economic statism is worse. And that's what it comes down to. And again, if Trump was going to abolish democracy this time, we can't undo the past. The question is, what is he going to do from here? I don't think he's going to stay in office forever. So, it's a big minus, but that's, neither candidate is perfect.
Yeah, a friend of mine called me yesterday and was saying, he's generally of my disposition on many of these questions, but he said to me, I think I'm potentially begrudgingly starting to believe that the MSNBC portrayal of Trump is right, meaning he thinks that
the critics of Trump are not without some good points. It's what is your primary versus secondary levels of concern, right? I think Trump is an egomaniac. I think he's often irresponsible. I think many of the criticisms of him on MSNBC are quite accurate, that I don't think he cares that much about maintaining America's institutions of democracy. But to me, the greater threat is disorder, crime, immigration, and an overly interventionist foreign policy. Where you listen to this Bob Woodward new book, War, about Joe Biden's foreign policy, and you hear Joe Biden castigating all these other players, such as Bibi Netanyahu, as they're not thinking clearly. And the book says almost nothing about how Joe Biden had recurrent severe episodes of senility throughout his administration, and yet he wanted to micromanage the wars of Ukraine and Israel, and obviously has not done it very well. I don't think Donald Trump will try to micromanage Bibi and Ukraine the way that the Biden administration did.
It could be the case that Trump actually is a full-blown fascist, despite being more skeptically inclined toward that argument for years, in part because the New York Times, within the past few days, published like a magazine-type article where they went and interviewed Paxton. What's his first name? Like the scholar? Ken Paxton, the political theorist who was one of the...
Right, this Paxton bloke, he's 92 years of age. And so he watched January 6th on TV, and he thought, oh my God, maybe Trump really is a fascist.
Who kind of came up with a theory of fascism.
Oh, no, Paxton is the Attorney General of Texas.
Paxton fascism. Robert Paxton.
Okay, yeah.
Who's in his 90s.
Yeah, I saw this headline.
Book on fascism or on collaborationist France, like Vichy France.
Yeah.
And Sensation is always been seen as an authoritative figure on fascism. And this piece that spells out that even when Trump was first running in 2016, and then even into his presidency, Paxton had pushed back on this reflexive labeling of Trump as fascist because Paxton questioned the utility of throwing around that term so capriciously.
Yeah, so Robert Paxton's the one expert in fascism who's come around to say Donald Trump does appear to be a fascist.
But then after January 6th, Paxton was watching the mob riot and said, okay, this qualifies as fascism. And there's the whole New York Times article on his evolution on that question. And they tie, my friend was tying it into Trump's rhetoric becoming even more dark and sinister, talking about the enemy.
It is deranged.
I don't find it. My argument to him was I don't find that to be meaningfully different from the 2016 version of this whole debate, when Trump was also being hysterically accused of representing some kind of fascist movement because people would latch on to some quip that he made here or there. But when you look at his record as president, which I find to be the most instructive as to
here's
developing my perspective on this, it just doesn't comport with any semblance of fascism. So I think there ought to be a critiques of Trump. I think there's actually not been enough sensible, rational critiques of Trump, especially within alternate media, which is now more or less transformed into a Republican propaganda fire hose. But that doesn't mean that the kind of cloistered elite liberal position on Trump, where they're always paranoid about fascism at the gate, is any more viable to me.
Well,
and they've been paranoid like this for years. Right, let me do a digression, and you'll see how I'm going to do a weave here like Donald Trump. So I was thinking about how plain-spoken Australians are and contrasting that to the more elaborate way that Americans speak, particularly of the educated class. And then I was thinking many of the elaborations that Americans are forced to use are exactly what you would expect in an increasingly diverse, lower trust, less cohesive, litigious society. All right. And many of the fibs that we have to say these days weren't there 60 years ago. So to be socially acceptable in American middle class and above, usually you have to boast about your work ethic, right? The type of work that you do matters a great deal more in America than in most countries. Americans have fewer worker protections, and men in particular have less social welfare available than any other first world people. So Americans are more vulnerable to loss of job, loss of health insurance, and loss of the ability to live in a safe neighborhood compared to other first world nations. So Americans must work particularly hard to live in a low crime neighborhood, while Australians and most other people can just take this luxury for granted. So as a result, there's a great deal more fear and anxiety among Americans than other first world nations, because you can fall so low, you can fall into desperate straits if you simply have a medical emergency that your insurance doesn't cover, or you don't have insurance, and it can drive you into bankruptcy. You can lose your job, lose your health insurance, and things can just spiral. As part of this insecurity, you have to usually align with the mission statement of your employer. And Americans tend to treat their work ethic and their employment much more seriously because of the vulnerability that they'll be exposed to if they lose their job. In the middle class and above, if you're educated, you have to pretend to be racially and sexually blind, as opposed to noting that different groups have different gifts. Men and women have different gifts. Women are better at some things, men are better at other things. Asians are better at some things, Ashkenazi Jews are better at some things, African Americans are better at some things. It's obvious truth, but it's not one that you can usually say out loud in educated circles. Right? You have to talk about bad neighborhoods and bad schools rather than about the bad people that make neighborhoods and schools dangerous. You can't reveal how much you hate certain groups because you have a life experience where certain groups are a consistent source of distress in your life rather than a source of joy. And in many social settings in the middle class and above, you need to appear guilty about the sins of racism, sexism, homophobia, and the like. America's civic culture requires that you act as though your particular hero system doesn't invalidate competing hero systems, when, of course, it does. If you are a believing Christian, right, you have to invalidate the claims of Judaism. If you are an observant Jew, all right, you cannot subscribe to the possibility that Christianity is divine truth. In educated circles, you need to pretend that America is the product of amazing ideas and its amazing founding documents, rather than noting that America's founding ideas and documents were overwhelmingly the product of particular people, Anglo-Saxons, and that the systems they started in America, the legal system and the political system, are not equally suited for all groups. If you're a bloke, you usually need to pretend that you equally enjoy the company of women that you don't want to bang, as opposed to just hanging out with men like yourself. You have to pretend that you see people as individuals rather than as members of groups. And it's just too time-consuming. It takes too much mental, cognitive processing to see everyone as an individual, right? We naturally use heuristics and shorthands, and aside from people we know well, we tend to look at them as members of groups, whether they're gay or black or Jewish or evangelical Christian. You need to play down how much of what you say and do is false, but it is necessary to do these false things to reduce the chances of litigation, such as you don't apologize when you are the cause of an accident. You often need to play down the high amount of discrimination that you practice to have a good life. You need to pretend to care about outgroups, and you often need to pretend about the horrible things that your ancestors did to outgroups, or that your current in-group is doing to outgroups right now. You need to pretend that you support small government and states' rights and other Republican euphemisms when you simply don't want to subsidize the generous social welfare directed that will be primarily used by outgroups. You often need to pretend that you care about some plucky foreign people who are the celebrated cause of the moment. So it's this or that group in Africa, or it's the Israelis or the Ukrainians or the Palestinians. You often need to pretend that they're important leaders of various victimhood groups, such as the race hustlers in much of Black life, Jewish life, gay life, trans, Mexican Americans, and pretend that they deserve respect, people like Al Sharpton. Pretend that there's an LGBTQ community, when in fact the various components of LGBT community have nothing in common with each other. You have to pretend that what unites us as Americans is more important than what divides us, and sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. Often you need to pretend that George Floyd was a great and worthy man. You have to pretend that the president of the United States or this or that politician is ipso facto worthy of respect, when in reality, the person's always a politician, and politicians deserve far more skepticism than deference and automatic respect. In many social circles, you need to maintain that Donald Trump is a threat to democracy. You have to be careful when you protest that your professor and your teaching assistant at university can't speak a type of English that you can understand. In many social circles, you need to deny that you own a gun or that you vote Republican. and usually need to deny that different groups have different interests. So I was looking up lies that Americans tell, and one of the first resorts was a New York Times column, June 6, 1971, 6 big lies about America. And guess what lie number 1 was? America is either a fascist country or is on the road to fascism. All right, this is 1971 column by Arnold Beckman, and he is best known for Beckman's law, which is that every revolution except for the American Revolution made its particular country worse. And Arnold Beckman writes here in the New York Times in 1971, this is all agreed among the social critics, among the chattering class, that America is a fascist country on the road to fascism. Right? This has been a dominant part of left-wing rhetoric going back to the 1940s. Now, there is some dispute about how soon before American fascism becomes real fascism. Charles Reich in The Greening of America tells us that America is at the brink of an authoritarian or police state. Tells us that today in America, both dissent and efforts at change are dealt with by repression. The Harvard Crimson announced that America soon will be living under real fascism before 3 years are over. Professor Herbert Marcuse said, one can speak with complete justification of an incipient fascism in America. Professor Phil Slater of Brandeis has written that liberals will be given the choice between participating in the new culture and living under a fascist regime. And legal director of the ACLU says, though we are not yet a fascist state, or though we are not now a police state, usefulness of this charge is that America is now or is about to go fascist, is that it is such a big lie that no evidence is needed to prove it. All these people who say Donald Trump is a fascist, the great thing about this big lie is that no evidence is needed to prove it. And when everything is evidence, right, you can just grab whatever is handiest. So by constant reiteration that America is pre or proto-fascist, America automatically becomes fascist, and all the scholarly qualifiers like incipient or preventive or not yet a fascist state get blurry and redundant. So any unpleasant or awful event in America can be transformed into living documentation that we now live in America with a K. So George Lucas says, it is the Stalinist tendency to exclude everywhere, so far as possible, any sort of mediating concepts and to bring into direct connection the crudest matters of fact with the most abstract theoretical positions. Does anyone really think that President Nixon, Vice President Agnew, and Henry Kissinger would dare impose a fascist regime on America, or that they are contemplating such a coup d'etat? And you can say the same thing. Do you really think that Donald Trump and J.D. Vance are planning to impose a fascist regime on America? And you'd find many revolutionaries who would say yes, many intellectuals who would say yes, but they are almost never scholars of fascism. Right? To demand some proof of this plotting and some evidence for this fascism charge, right, we'll get your response like, well, maybe he's not fascist yet, but just give him time and you'll see. And in much of intellectual discourse in 1971 and today, it's possible to add up every single act of injustice as proof of the existence of fascism in America. And a scholarly and objective way to pin the fascist label on America is to blur the distinction between this country and the Soviet Union. So Howard Zinn wrote, when the United States defines the Soviet sphere as totalitarian and the West as free, it becomes difficult for Americans to see totalitarian elements in our own society and liberal elements in Soviet society. Then the other big lies, America is guilty of genocide, that the bomber left in America is a moral force. So you had the Weather Underground at this time setting off bombs all across the country, sometimes killing people. That the American worker is a honky who revels in racial discrimination, imperialist wars, fascism, anti-intellectualism, blind anti-communism, and other political sports. And this lie is being trotted out today for Donald Trump voters. Lie number 5, our political system is an utter fraud, particularly the two-party system, and America is on the way down while other countries are on the way up. So those are 6 big lies popular in America today in a column written in 1971, but so much of it equally applies to what's going on today.
So the response, the standard MSNBC New York Magazine Daily Beast response to this is that Trump hired people like Mattis and John Kelly and so forth, H.R. McMaster, serious people, and they basically, I mean, you can go watch. There's Chris Hayes was ranting about this a couple nights ago. Basically, they were like,
this was his argument that I listened to on the plane yesterday.
Hayes.
Ezra Klein had a whole podcast.
Yeah. Exactly. Oh, yes, exactly. So you know this argument. You know the standard argument. So yeah. I mean, I find that credible. Why do you not find it credible?
Credible because the so-called adults in the room, like McMaster, like Mattis, like maybe even Kelly to some extent, they were seen as representing this adult influence on Trump because they were advocating just standard, fair, establishmentarian policies, particularly in the domain of foreign affairs. So Trump escalated the war in Afghanistan early on in his first term. It was like August of 2017, I believe. And it was reported at the time that Trump was supposedly reluctant to escalate in Afghanistan, just like, Biden's been, quote, reluctant to send Ukraine various weapon systems, or John F. Kennedy was reluctant to escalate.
You're talking about foreign policy. Well, first of all,
I don't find these supposed adult influences or guardrails to produce particularly beneficial outcomes, because the supposed instinct within Trump that they were constraining primarily was whatever fleeting and inchoate instinct that Trump had not to engage in interventionist foreign policy.
Well, okay, there's that. I mean, there was.
So these are people who have a particular ideological perspective, who aren't just saying that they needed to counteract Trump's most genuinely destructive instincts, but that they felt that Trump was transgressing certain boundaries of ideological propriety.
Well, it's that too. Yeah, but it's both.
It's hard to disentangle. So I guess I wouldn't just automatically assume that people of that orientation, that political orientation, necessarily have the higher ground of on Trump, because they have a certain predisposition about what correct U.S. policy is. And you saw this
sucks. Oh, and by the way, foreign policy, I'm the opposite of you. I love Israel. I wanted to win the war, and so this is another good reason to support Trump.
All right, well, that's an inspiring message. I mean, Elon Musk involved even less takeover of Twitter in 2022. In fact, I kind of defended it because I thought it was just very histrionic how people were saying that this would destroy the company. It didn't destroy the company. He downsized it. There are some technical glitches maybe, but by and large, it kind of functions roughly similar just in terms of the core operations of the platform. But, he's running around campaigning for Trump, offering people millions of dollars to vote for Trump effectively. And when I pull up my app nowadays, I get 7 consecutive Musk tweets of him promoting his latest pro-Trump town hall, encouraging people to vote Republican, etc. So yeah, I do have an instinctual aversion to this because it's amazing how blatant and brazen it is, and I do think it's done a bit of damage to the viability of X as a platform. Just for trying to.
Yeah, I'm not as bothered. Like a billionaire, the conservatives are hypocrites, because conservatives are like, we live under an authoritarian regime because big tech censors the Hunter Biden laptop story for very briefly. They're hypocrites now. Obviously, they don't see anything untoward. They pretend like they're like you. When it's the other side doing it, and now they have nothing negative to say at all. So they're hypocrites. Me, I'm not bothered either way. I just, it's like rich people influence things, government influences things. I mean, as long as it's not, government banning people or people banning me, I sort of take it out very.
The media ecosystem. I could name others like Joe Rogan constantly promoted RFK Jr.
Yeah, I don't media. I consider outlets to be media. I don't
talk too many people, but I'm saying prominent sort of political podcasters, maybe slightly apolitical in general, but comedians and stuff, because they were so enthralled with the supposed esteemed.
Why do you expect anything from that? If I see Alex Jones is acting inconsistent or saying things that don't make sense, I don't be like, oh, Alex, that drives me crazy. It's like, no, I just see him as a crazy person. If you're seeing Eric Weinstein or Brett Weinstein, either one, as your intellectual lodestar, somebody who you expect to get the straight truth from, these people are out of their minds.
There's a broader ecosystem of people as well. Even main.
Okay, back to John Podhoretz here and the Commentary Magazine crew.
Harrison, I just went to the doctor, and now we have Trump as Hitler. Hitler's here. Hitler's going on Joe Rogan today, Friday, October 25th. And as the Wall Street Journal editorial page points out this morning, apparently Democratic Senate candidates in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin are more than happy to feature Hitler in their ads in the final days of the campaign, because rather than mentioning Biden or Harris, they're showing how they worked with Trump during his first administration. And then just finally, it might just be me. Now, I'm not known to be, plugged in to the culture.
Talking
but
to the insanely
when I look
popular
at
podcast
Harris,
of Joe Rogan, and this was posted yesterday.
I always got more publicity than other people.
Oh, I could definitely tell you. You said a lot of wild
Maybe. Maybe
you said a lot of wild and then CNN, in all their brilliance, by highlighting your wild made you much more popular. And the media, to a large extent, acts as a propaganda arm for the Democratic Party.
Joining us now from New York, Caroline Downey, a staff writer for National Review, and with me, Philippe Reines, who played Donald Trump in debate prep with Kamala Harris and was a top State Department official under Hillary Clinton. Caroline, what does Trump get out of a 3-hour sit-down with Joe Rogan and that particular audience, which went off into, are there aliens in outer space and lots of other stuff? It racked up 11 million views in just less than a day.
Right. In under 10 hours, I'll add, it racked up over, 10, 11 million views. And you know how of course, Trump waxed philosophical about extraterrestrial topics and, whale psychiatry and other wonky things. But this interview humanized him. And that's the net benefit to his campaign, because with every TV hit that Kamala Harris does, she comes off more bitter, more angry, and more jaded, whereas Trump comes off as a normal guy. And this audience that Joe Rogan caters to is predominantly Gen Z. It's young people. His pop culture podcast alone has an audience of 14 million people. So, Kamala Harris claims she's trying to cater to the younger generation, but she's sticking to legacy media interviews for the most part, and she refused to go on Rogan.
Well,
okay, back to commentary.
Crossing the country with Bruce Springsteen and Beyonce and the cast of The West Wing, which I believe has been off the air for almost 20 years. I get the sense that her surrogates are kind of these celebrity, if they're
Democrats, is when you control all the media, you never have to deal or even know that there's an alternative around. And that is true. I think this election will show that's true of popular culture as well. The Democrats control most of the major cultural institutions, Hollywood, whatnot, and they are her candidacy seems completely unaware of the Bro podcast, and not just the Bro podcast, but a whole subculture of podcasts, some of which Donald Trump has very successfully appeared on as a candidate. And there's a lot of deja vu here, right? Like there's Beyonce and Springsteen did the same thing for Hillary in 2016.
Which really does raise the question, why is Hillary Clinton published her 78th autobiography? Why is she doing this to us? Why is she on TV? Why are people having her? Why would Kamala Harris want her as a surrogate? What the hell is going on? This is not helpful.
There's another aspect to this, that relates to this, which is, I think if you're an American who is financially struggling, not happy with the economy, not terribly trusting in an assortment of American institutions, celebrity culture itself doesn't dazzle you at the
answer any questions. I think there was in the Axios report today.
This is the Democratic panic.
Talking about Democratic panic, there was a quote from an advisor saying, or a businessman, it was a former Obama person who's now on Wall Street, saying, I spend tens of thousands of dollars on lobbyists and analysts, and none of them can tell me what she actually believes. And
I want to make out whether or not we were sounding triumphalist about Trump or not, and what that might mean given the distasteful qualities of Trump. But what all this indicates is that Harris is the subject of the campaign, not Trump. And that we're not talking about Trump, we're talking about Harris. And the political class is talking about Harris, it's not talking about Trump. And she spent 3 days this week, or the establishment around her spent 3 days this week trying to shift the subject back to Trump is Hitler.
If you're calling someone Hitler, that's all well and good, but what does that mean for me, the voter, sitting here looking at my family's budget and going, I can't afford to live the way I could 10 years ago, 5 years ago, even 2 years ago?
And I also think so much of this has to do with the fact that she, as a person, has come into sharper focus than she was when she first appeared in the joyful convention. And
the enthusiasm is crazy. The money is crazy. Democrats who were falling away from Biden are all just going to simply go back to her. And that all she had to do was run a competent campaign to win. There were questions about whether she could run a competent campaign. We all heard during the course of the Biden presidency that he had no confidence in her, that they thought she was bad. Her approval rating numbers were bad. She did a bad
show. Kip, what's going on, man? Long time no talk.
Right. You having a good week?
I am. Thank you.
I'm a little bit behind. I'm about, I think I'm at minus 26 minutes trying to get caught up at 1.5. But when you put your clips on 1.25, it's too much. When I have you at 1.5, and then you go 1.25 on their clips, it starts sounding like chipmunks or something. You know what I mean?
I got it.
So anyway, I was just it keeps dawning on me that reality is so long gone here in America that I'm afraid it's going to have to be like war or inflation or something horrible to be like the only antidote. You know what I'm saying? A big dose of reason. Nobody's willing to take that. You get what I'm saying? That kind of medicine, I think we're beyond that. What do you think? Do you not notice how there's no room for discussion anywhere?
Well, there is room for discussion. Most people live their lives with their family, extended family, and friends, and they discuss what they want within those circles. All right. Most people are quite realistic about the things most important to them, which usually consists of their family, extended family, friends, community, and their profession and income and hobbies. So that's where life resides for the overwhelming majority of people. Most people are not as obsessed with politics and philosophy and mysticism as we are.
Mm-hmm. Well, you get what I'm saying. If someone can't legitimately, get some understanding, it's going to have to be smacked under their head. You get what I'm saying? It's going to have to come the way they don't want it to come. And I'm
right.
just
Here's a great test. Let's just make this really practical. If you are out of touch with reality, you will get humiliated. Right? There is no way to go through your life out of touch with reality and not get humiliated on a regular basis. You will try to intrude into places and conversations where you are not wanted. You will have an exaggerated understanding of your own relative level of importance or capability. And so if you are in a state of delusion, you will get regular reminders of humiliation. If you, on the other hand, are not getting regularly humiliated, right, then you are in touch with reality. So that's the great test. How often do you get humiliated? How often do you get fired? How often do friends and family completely turn their backs on you and cut ties? How often do people who you look to for support and help refuse to step up? How often do people who you thought were your friends turn out not to be your friends? All right, these are all humiliating revelations. If you are not experiencing any of these, you're living in reality. If you are experiencing these things, you are not living in reality.
Yeah. Sometimes I guess it's just recently dawned on me. I guess it was actually that last election, how frothy Dems are about killing babies, and that should be the one thing that we can all agree on, is you should be taking care of the very oldest among us, and you should be taking care of the very youngest among us. And by God, nothing's younger than a baby in the womb. But it seems like scams. We live in a world now of you think the culture's okay. I'm telling you, it's rotten, because I see old people. Seems like every third phone call I get is someone trying to scam an old person. And thank God I'm not my mom answering the phone, because they would have got her. You know what I'm saying? But so it's the oldest people and the youngest people, the babies, that nobody seems to give a damn about. And I realize I'm out of step on that whole abortion thing now. But why is it ever supposed to be cool? They're killing out of convenience. You realize this? They're killing. They're wanting to kill babies just because. I want to be able to wake up and say, yeah, I feel like being a mama, or nah, I don't feel like being a mama. It's pure convenience.
Yes, it is. Abortions overwhelmingly are a matter of inconvenience. And from my perspective, abortions are overwhelmingly immoral, the vast majority of abortions. But I don't agree with you that we're living in a culture that's rotten. If you think American culture is so rotten, where would you say it's just so much better?
You're going to try that with me, but I don't know, because it's the only culture. It's the fish tank that I'm submerged in. You get what I'm saying? So I can't really answer that question.
Well,
but
what
maybe
are,
I
what are
could.
some good things about American culture? You focus overwhelmingly on the horrible parts of America. So let me push you. Why don't you name some of the good things about American culture?
I don't know. I would ask you because I haven't really watched anything. I think the last movie I went to the theater and watched was called like Con Air, maybe in 1998.
That
And
was
I
a great
definitely
film. I loved that movie.
that happened to be like the third movie in a row that my old lady told me. It's 3 movies in a row I've taken. We went to the movies and you keep falling asleep. This maybe you shouldn't be going to the movies. So I don't know. Maybe I get so into back then. I would get so into the workday. You get what I'm saying? The stories. It seemed like by the late 90s, 97, 98, they had become enthralled with like a sci-fi gadgetry, and the storylines were what was suffering at that point. So maybe I slept through 1 or 2 good movies, but I'm just saying on the whole, I would be asking you what's good about the culture. You might fire back something like the Yankees versus the Dodgers or whatever, but I'd go back to Ted.
I thought Con Air was a terrific movie. You didn't enjoy Con Air.
I don't know. I fell asleep. So
okay.
Something.
Okay,
you get what I'm saying?
You've had a battery beeping in the background for days now. Why haven't you changed the battery?
I don't know, because all the batteries I have came from the dollar store, and I keep replacing them, and it keeps lasting about like 12 days, 14 days. And I noticed the same problem was happening when I changed the battery in my audio speaker remote control, that it doesn't seem to last very long. So I just think I need to go invest in some decent batteries, because I have about like a whole handful of batteries, but they're not worth the effort to go up there and stick up there at the top of the 9-foot ceiling. You know, my ceilings are so tall, I have to find some way to climb up there. And I keep climbing up there only to hear that damn thing going off within 2 weeks. And, you know, it's I'll be a little bit of a jogger about it between now and the time I get back to the Walmart again. So I think I'm on like 11 days now. I'm on like 11 days since my last Walmart run. So anyway, so you don't see there's.
I see there are problems in American culture. I see that there's rotten aspects of American culture, but that also has to be weighed against the good things in American culture. So one good thing in American culture is that there's more individual freedom in the United States than any other country in the world of which I'm aware. There's more freedom of speech in the United States than any other country of which I'm aware. That there is generally an optimism in the United States, historically in the American culture compared to almost any other culture. Americans have consistently been more optimistic. There's a pragmatic can-do attitude that has dominated American culture down through history. There's a spirit of innovation, and that still continues, right? Americans are still more innovative and creative than any other culture. Americans.
There's the one thing I'll give you. Can I tell you? Can I agree with you? There's one thing that we as Americans can't see that you coming from Australia or somebody coming from England can see. We have something entrepreneurial in us that the rest of the world generally doesn't have. That's the one thing that I would say this soup does help us. But by the same token, I sit around and wonder why, for example, we're the only people that have to pay, healthcare insurance. If we want to do like Luke wants to do and cover all our bases or whatever, it seems like all the other first world countries take care of that for their people, and we're just being a little obstinate and making our own people take care of that. Where I would say, why not give someone basic services like I would have had in the Marines at sick bay? And if someone wants to get all Mayo Clinic-y or John Hopkins-y with their medical care, that's okay. We know there will be billionaires to keep those places going. So what do you think about how we're so unique in having to pay for our own health care?
Well, there are good and bad things about it. First of all, why are we unique in not having national health care? And the reason is that Americans don't want to pay for socialized medicine that they believe will be disproportionately used by black people. And that's
Right. And they're right. Nobody, like, I can squeeze out $1 better than the government can. So can Luke Ford. So can 99% of Americans. So I can understand the efficiency part of that. But that's why I say, that's why I use the word basic, because even some of the guys showing up at sick bay when I was in the Marines, they just didn't want to go to work that day. You see what I'm saying, Luke? So
well,
you're
even
right.
with the most basic, even with the most basic health insurance, it would be disproportionately used by those who take far more in social welfare than they contribute to the tax base, and Americans are tired of that. If America was a more homogeneous society, then we'd have socialized medicine. But those Americans who vote against socialized medicine are sick and tired of certain low-achieving groups sucking up a disproportionate amount of social welfare spending. So that's why we don't have it. And not having national health insurance, socialized medicine, comes with some good things. It spurs people to go get a job. It spurs people to take individual initiative. It spurs people to take on responsibility and to work hard. Americans work harder than almost any other people of which I'm aware. And I think working hard is overwhelmingly a good thing. Certainly you can overdo it, but generally speaking, working hard, I think, is about the most ennobling thing that somebody can do. So there are good things about how it's almost impossible for an adult male to get social welfare. And that is it spurs men in particular to work hard. Other things about American culture, we tend to think big, all right? And whether it's going to Mars or inventing the internet or just the big portions, I mean, the big food portions are probably a downside to this think big attitude. Or American pornography, it emphasizes, big tits and big dicks. Americans love it big. Americans love convenience. And so if you move to any other country, you will find it considerably less convenient. You'll also find it considerably less efficient. The American economy is overall about the most efficient in the world. We have beautiful national parks. There is a large part of America that just loves competition, whether it's at school or in sports. I like the competitive nature of competition. I love the relative emotional openness and intensity of Americans compared to the stiff upper lip culture more dominant in Australia, New Zealand, and England. So I'm thinking about a story. An American woman told she went to the Sydney Opera House, and after a performance, she stood up and clapped, and she was the only one standing up. So Americans are far more willing to show enthusiasm and to be naked in their emotions than other people. There is a great value in being independent and self-sufficient among many Americans. So after age 18, most Americans no longer live at home with their parents. They do their own shopping, their own laundry, their own cooking, and they go pursue their careers on their own. So there are many good things about that.
I will agree with you that America is the land of opportunity. Don't get me wrong. What I'm trying to tell you is the price that's being paid for that is a lot more hefty than people realize. And maybe I can weave this in. Recently Trump in an interview with someone started talking about the way he weaves certain things out of conversations, and the takeaway line I took from that interview was, "The weave is the way." So I'm going to try to attempt a weave here. My street was replaced about a week ago, and it really, to me, it showed how powerful the mind is, because I spent days trying to repattern myself to getting back up to speed on something as silly as like a 1.2 mile road. And to me, it shows how the mind, what you and I have talked about before, the robot portion of the mind, how susceptible it is to all the media poison that's hurled towards Donald Hitler or Donald Trump or Adolf Trump or whatever they're calling him this week. And they say that they hate Trump, but you and I have seen videos of these nannies on The Views all giving Trump a big hug and a kiss when he was on the show at 2011. It was only when he started speaking his brand of truth to power that they started giving him the same, treatment that they used to give Hitler. But one thing I will say is they say they hate Trump, but what they really hate is the kind of person who would vote for Trump. And it's contemptuous now. In the same way I told you that I knew when my marriage was over, when I knew there was contempt. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's not contempt for Trump. On the outward, he's the avatar that they're throwing the darts at. But it's you, Luke Ford. You're the son of a gun they hate. You realize that, right? And a big dose of reality that nobody's talked to, if you and I can break this, is he got 60 million votes in 2016, and then he got 75 million votes in 2020. And let's just say he only gets 75 million more. Well, by God, that's 210 million votes telling you people to stick your BS where the sun don't shine. Okay, now correct me if I'm wrong. There ain't gonna be no man in history of America ever got 210 million votes. Am I right, Luke?
Yeah, well, obviously that's true, but it'd be more useful to understand that as whatever ratio of the American population. As the American population keeps getting bigger, obviously the major party candidates are going to get more votes. But what percentage of Americans do you think instinctively hate Trump voters? I would argue to you that it's fewer than 5%, because most Americans are not as preoccupied by politics as we are.
I would tell you that back in 2011, it was probably 1%, maybe 2% that didn't like his flamboyance, his P.T. Barnumness. You know what I mean? That part of him. They didn't appreciate that. And let me be honest, I didn't either. I saw him as more of a showman than anything that was real, because he has had successes and he has had failures. But I'm going to say since 2016, when they took the gloves off and they said, we're going to really demonize this guy, 24%. You can ask the chat what they think, but I think the number's a lot. I think the well's been poisoned by that many people. And then you put in all these little pet things like the way that they want to kill babies out of convenience, and they're real good at pigeonholing people into things into voting in ways they wouldn't vote. And another thing, Luke, you don't think that The Rock or any of these people has any influence on them, but I think that stuff does have influence on people, because The Rock or whoever might be the favorite show, that might be the favorite character of the show, and the real life Breaking Bad character is now telling you Trump is Hitler. And I don't know, to you and me, it's not going to have any effect, but to somebody that really loves that character in Breaking Bad, maybe it does have an effect. Maybe they'll second guess their own thinking. And that's where I try to weave it back to like that road. Our mind is susceptible to things that we don't even realize, that all that stuff that you think is just flying right off you like water off a duck's back is really sinking in ways the same way those damn potholes in my road sunk in, for months and months.
Then,
to where my brain.
How are we here? If we evolve to be gullible, how a human being still here? It just doesn't make any evolutionary sense. If we are as gullible as you present, there's no way we'd still be alive. We would have died out as a species.
I don't know, but I think we are that gullible. Changing the channel just a little bit.
Wait. Hang on. And you said something else. You said that 25% of Americans hate Trump voters. Only about 5% of Americans are intense about politics. So I just don't think there's any way that 20 to 25% of Americans instinctively hate Trump voters. I just think there's no evidence for that. Most people lead lives overwhelmingly revolving around their family, their friends, and their work and their community. Most people don't live lives revolving around politics.
Yeah, I would say the 5% that you're talking about, that's only 1 in 20 people. Those would be the people more apt to maybe see through it. I'm telling you, it's the people that don't stop and really take a look at it. They're the ones that are going to fall for it, because they're, like I've told you before, from the time they wake up in the morning, they're hearing Trump's a dirtbag on the View, and they're hearing it on the nightly shows when they go to bed at night. They're hearing it in between, on MSNBC or whatever, and in the back of their minds, they're going, well, ABC says this, CBS says this, NBC says this. They can't all be bullshitting me. And so if they did have any thoughts that Trump was okay, hell, just the mere numbers of people telling them that, eventually it works. That's the way propaganda works. So it's unfortunately, and it's the same thing that I was going to mention to you just now about Giuliani. They see
wait, before we get Giuliani, there's no evidence that propaganda works this way. All the Nazi propaganda did not change people who hated Hitler and the Nazis. Their minds weren't changed. Or the communist propaganda, whether in the Soviet Union or China, did not change minds to people who hated communism. We simply have no evidence that propaganda is particularly effective, right? Nazis appealed to people who were aligned with the Nazi worldview, and it was opposed and disdained by people who were against that worldview. And all of Goebbels' propaganda in the world did not change those basic facts. Okay, back to you.
Okay. Well, I would say like what they're doing right now with Giuliani is a message. So maybe that wouldn't be outward propaganda, but it's sending a message. It's saying, you could be next. And I think that's why when someone like Elon Musk tells you, Trump either wins now, or this could be it for me, because he sees what happened with that other, I forget what that social media site guy had. And they took him into custody. And then you got with Giuliani, he's told to give up everything, including grandpa's old watch. And that was a federal court. And I think that was wasn't that a Trump appointee that did that to him?
No, he wasn't a Trump appointee. He was someone who was absolutely reckless and crazy in the things that he said, and he had to bear responsibility for his words. No legitimate law firm would take up Donald Trump's case that the 2020 election was rigged. So very different from the 2000 election, where the best of the Republican lawyers rallied to the cause to get George W. Bush over the hump. But in 2020, the evidence was so clear that no reputable law firm would back Donald Trump's lies. But Giuliani would just take it up on his own and make a crazy, deranged case. The man is off his rocker. His drinking is out of control, and he had to take responsibility. He had to receive the punishment that his bad behavior richly deserved. Just like Alex Jones, when he libeled people who libeled the parents of that school shooting and made their lives miserable by claiming it was just crisis actors, when it was a very real shooting that killed a lot of kids. So Alex Jones behaved in a despicable fashion, and I'm glad that he was that he lost those lawsuits and is losing his business. All right, people should have to take responsibility for their words.
So you're okay with the two joggers down in Georgia getting Grandpa's Giuliani's watch? You're okay with that?
I'm okay. I don't know the specifics on that, but I'm okay with Giuliani getting punished for his despicable behavior after the 2020 election. So I'm generally sympathetic to the prosecution of Giuliani.
Did you catch the hubris in the Wall Street or Washington Post, I guess is what it was, the editor who quit once Bezos decided they weren't going to do endorsements? Did you?
Yeah, I thought it was hilarious, because it doesn't matter to normal people whether or not the LA Times or the Washington Post endorses someone for president, but it's a top three story for elites. And I'm glad that these people quit, because that'll the Washington Post, the LA Times will be better off without them.
The editor who quit in protest
Robert Kagan.
okay. He God, it's so rich. It sounds crazy even saying it. He said Trump has too much control over the media in America. Did you catch the height of pomposity in that statement he gave?
No,
I think CNN, I think it was CNN he was talking to in the last day or two, and he said that, and it was just the things that kept rolling off his tongue. I was like, what planet is this guy even living on? I mean, it was crazy. But
he's married to Victoria Nuland, who was deeply involved in overthrowing Ukraine's democratically elected president in 2014. And she was deeply involved in all sorts of State Department shenanigans in Ukraine. And that's his wife.
Victoria Nuland is?
Yep.
Oh, man. Yeah.
Yeah, quite a couple.
No more. Yeah. Say no more about that. One thing, I don't know. There's so much. Washington, D.C. is such a cesspool. Has anybody ever thrown around the idea of maybe moving the Capitol, to try to get all those entrenched groups where they can't just control the damn, everything in D.C.? Does that ever come up in talking? Do people ever say that in media about like, why is the Capitol still in Washington, D.C.? Or is that just not a thing?
No, I've heard the case made for moving various departments out of the Capitol, but DC is just a symptom. It's not the cause. There's no geographic solution for the problem that you're talking about. The founders of the Constitution created a system whereby special interests would get to lobby for their interests, and that's been the American way since day one. It comes with certain advantages and certain disadvantages, and I don't know. You could have an English-style system where you don't have special interests with that much power, but it's hard for me to see that the United Kingdom top-down system where special interests don't have much power, where it's not a federal system, it's hard for me to see that that's just plainly superior. It's superior in some ways, and it's inferior in others. And the American system has its vulnerabilities, such as to special interests, but that's also a strength that citizens get to band together and to lobby for their interests.
That's really about all I had today. I just wanted to reiterate that I do feel that there's contempt now between both sides of the aisle, and these are not even the crazy wing sides of it. I'm talking about just they don't like the fact that 75 million Americans could vote for Trump, but they're not willing to consider how we all watched the way they treated that guy. I'm sure on day one you didn't jump in bed with the whole Trump idea, did you? What was the deciding fact with you, Mr.
Yeah, I was never a fan of Donald Trump, and when a friend told me that Trump had announced he's running for president, I treated it with disdain. And then over the next few weeks, as Trump started having to pay a price for his remarks, and he was willing to pay the price and not back down, and I saw he was getting increasingly respectful consideration on Steve Saylor's blog and among the commentators, I started to change my mind, and then I finally changed it in August of 2015. For the first time, I watched a Trump rally, and I felt something. I felt something when I watched it. I saw his plane circle the crowd. It was the rally where Jeff Sessions stood up to endorse him. So I felt something before I thought something. It created a visceral tingle in me. And then when Trump gave a talk and he spoke about the power of good genes, I thought, oh, this guy gets it, and his stand on immigration. So it was August of 2015 when I began jumping to bat for Donald Trump, and that was on a Friday afternoon, and then the next morning in synagogue, I was telling everyone that Donald Trump was going to win the election.
Right. With me, it was probably a little bit later on, but I saw him piling on. It was the piling on and the fact that it didn't matter if what they were saying was true. you know, and how there had whatever standards they may have had up to that point. I had seen the same type of thing happen with Ron Paul, so I reflexively gravitated towards him the way I did with Ron Paul, because I said, I need to pay attention to this guy. They're giving him the Ron Paul treatment. He must be saying something that's true. You know what I mean? That's something different than the line of BS that everybody else. Because if you remember, you probably won't remember with Ron Paul, that was the 2008 election. And in 2007, when they would give him the platform, he was trying to tell people that they were kind of getting ready to go off a financial cliff. And I'd be doggone if they didn't do it right as Obama was taking office. So he seemed to be telling truth to power. Then it seemed like Trump was doing the same thing. But you may have covered this before, but I'd like to leave you with this. I just want to ask you a question, and you can finish up with me and answer that question. And I was just going to, you sort of disavowed the Seventh-Day Adventist way of life and chose the enigmatic Jewish way of life. And if you wouldn't mind, just tell me a little bit about what the thought process was to make you, walk away from the one and align with the other like that. Because neither one of those are very, what you call popular. You get what I'm saying?
Right. They're both high intensity religion. So I was raised Seventh-day Adventist, but we got a TV for the first time at age 14. And so the world depicted on TV, particularly the prospect of sex with beautiful women, sucked me out of Seventh-day Adventism. Also, my father got himself ejected from the Seventh-day Adventist ministry when I was 14. So I no longer was living in the warm, supportive, communal belly of the Seventh-day Adventist Church after age 14. So I move out into the secular world, but I can't fully take advantage of the secular world because my dad, even though we now belong to quote unquote, and I'm quoting my father, the invisible Church of Jesus Christ, there was still essentially all the Seventh-day Adventist strictures, but there was not the Seventh-day Adventist community that makes the strictures worth it. So I become tempted by the outside world. And by age 18, I decide I move out of the house, move back to Australia with my brother, and I decide that I'm an atheist now. And so I'm kind of excited about being an atheist, and then I get really sick. And so my excitement about atheism just falls away as I now need something to establish meaning and purpose in my life. And so this is now 22, and I'm at UCLA. And so I have lived outside of the Seventh-day Adventist community largely now for 8 years. And I think there's part of me that recognizes there was something good in that way of life. And I'm looking for something similar to it, though I may not have been thinking clearly in those terms. Then I heard Dennis Prager on the radio, and I formed an emotional connection, a virtual relationship with this radio talk show host. And I met Jews for the first time at UCLA, and I became fascinated by these high-achieving, hyperverbal, intelligent, emotionally intense people. And I just became obsessed with Jews and with Judaism. And it was a presentation of a religion that made sense to me, that it was primarily about action rather than belief. And I just really enjoyed being around Jews, and I was just fascinated by my studies. And so I was able to kind of let go. I didn't want to go back to Seventh-day Adventism. I flirted with it, but it was too pious. I just felt much more comfortable among Jews. So Jews compared to Seventh-day Adventists are much more emotional. They're much more emotionally intense. They're much more open. They're much more frank and brutal. And they are much more focused on this world, while Seventh-day Adventism is focused on the next world. So I was just much more at ease and much happier among Jews and immersing myself in Judaism, while the gentle Jesus, meek and mild, believe in me and you'll have eternal life, just was not an appealing message for me.
That makes perfect sense. And I don't know, maybe fatalism is the wrong word, but I always felt that some of those religions, like those, Millerism offshoots, they had that little fatalism aspect to them. You know what I'm saying?
Yes,
That
about
something's coming
fatalism
in there.
about this world. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, hey, I appreciate you giving me that explanation, because I understand now you being put on the out group, seeing what happened to your dad. That would make it a whole lot easier. And I would think that, my God, whatever happened from 14 to 18, that must have been a massive culture shift. So
Yes.
I appreciate you giving me that little bit of insight. Thanks, man. I'll talk to you here in a couple of days.
Okay, sounds great. Good to talk to you, Kip. So,
Hey, buddy.
take care. So I want to talk more about when did I board the Trump train, because I made some notes on it, and I might as well share it. So June 16, 2015, that's when Donald Trump announced he was running for president. A friend of mine listened to his speech on the radio, and when we met up that morning, he told me that I would love Donald Trump because he was saying all the things that I was saying about problems such as illegal immigration. So that morning, I had no enthusiasm for Donald Trump. I didn't take him seriously. I thought he was a joke. I dismissed my friend's comments. I'd never been a fan of Donald Trump. I just found him distasteful. Then I ransacked my social media and my email history, and it was 12 days later that a friend of mine emailed my quote-unquote advisory committee about Donald Trump. And there was just a lot of joking about it, but my friend Jaime Malik says, Trump's the only man running who understands our immigration problem and is willing to talk about it. Deep in your heart, you know he's right. And another friend says, well, if Don comes in second in a primary or two or even wins one, they won't be able to keep him out of the debates. Donald debating is something I'd love to see. Yes, the debates will be interesting to watch. They should be on Comedy Central. And July 4, 2015, I made my first mention of Donald Trump on Facebook and Twitter by quoting this from a friend. The outrage over Trump's comments is interesting to watch. I've seen no one try to refute his statements on the facts. Then that same day I posted, until Trump came along, all the candidates were avoiding the immigration issue, including that prancing clown Scott Walker, who was caught several times showing his open borders bona fides. I was still skeptical that Donald Trump was for real, but I started a Donald Trump category on my blog July 9, 2015. And so I think from that date on, I was aboard the Trump Express. So Trump announced June 16, 2015. And July 9, I started a category for him on my blog. So about 3 weeks later. Did not mention Trump on my Facebook again until July 17, when I liked his video, Donald Trump full press conference with families of people killed by illegal aliens. And then I liked a video by American Renaissance entitled Why Donald Trump is Leading the Pack. July 14, in a private Facebook chat, I wrote, Blowhood, Trump is tapping into nationalist sentiments. July 19, I posted on Facebook a comment that I read in the comment section of Steve Saylor. Trump could say, look, I respect everyone who served, captured or not, but back when America was great and we won wars, our heroes were men who did the capturing like Alvin York. Let's make America great again. July 21, I posted on Facebook another comment I read in this comment section of Steve Saylor. John McCain called Donald Trump supporters a bunch of crazy people. Why are Donald Trump supporters crazy? Because they want to see immigration levels in this country reduced and they want to secure our border. John McCain is a shill for cheap third world labor. Then July 23, I posted on Facebook another comment I read, probably from Steve Saylor's blog. Trump has pushed the Overton window so wide, its gaping hole resembles Andrew Raw Muscle Glutes Sullivan's prolapsing rectum. July 30, posted a Facebook comment by a friend. Trump could win the Republican nomination for sure unless he does a Ross Perot and runs from his destiny. Then same day I posted, in Trump's case, he appears to be cornering the market on white voters, the backbone of the Republican Party. Republicans need as many white votes as possible to offset demographic shifts in the United States that have handed Democrats an electoral advantage in the last two presidential elections. I posted July 31, manly manner for Donald Trump, girly manner for Jeb Bush. As my Rebbe Chaim Amalek says to the Sodomites, you do not understand the yearnings of the heterosexual Christian American man, be he white or black. Thus, you and many others are in for a surprise or two as the election season unfolds. And I kept posting about Donald Trump through July into August. And then August 21, I watched a Trump rally in Mobile, Alabama that afternoon. My life forever changed. I thought this man was for real. I'm excited. I posted on Facebook, I'm watching Donald Trump live. He just said that he comes from good genes. Do you believe in genes? I believe in the gene thing, nature over nurture. And the next morning, August 22nd, 2015, I started telling people it's sure that Donald Trump could win. Nobody believed me. And Steve Saylor was taking him seriously fairly early on. So Steve Saylor, about 2 weeks after Trump announced, he first mentioned Trump in a blog headline. Donald Trump is getting under the skin of Catalina Bush. Then he does another post the next day. Claude Monet is the new Donald Trump. July 15th, next Steve Saylor headline. One Clinton denounces Trump, other Clinton, Bill Clinton, mum about his continued membership at Trump National Golf Club. July 27, what is Donald Trump up to? July 31, Bernie Sanders ruining isolate Trump strategy. August 4, the debate on immigration we need, Donald Trump versus Carlos Slim. And then you just have an avalanche of Steve Saylor blog posts and essays. The first Steve Saylor blog commenter to mention Donald Trump after he announced his run for president was Jefferson, who wrote June 17, Donald Trump is never boring. Next comment, June 20, poster says, any comment on the Donald? Far be it from me to comment on the stupid party, but selecting a rich blowhard during a recession doesn't sound like a winning strategy. Then another bloke commented June 20, 2015, I like Trump's speech. He was talking about how the middle class gets raped by trade deals, wants to enforce immigration laws. If I vote in the Republican primary, I would probably vote for him. He looks like a god compared to the other candidates. On election night, Steve Saylor wrote that Donald Trump was heroic for entering the race to become president. Right, here's the commentary crew.
Job when they gave her things to do. Biden didn't leave, and other people weren't advising him that he should leave, like Nancy Pelosi, because they didn't think that Harris was up to the job. But it looked for a while like she was at least up for the candidacy. And the story of the last 2 months, and particularly the last 2 weeks, is that she's not up for this. Doesn't mean she's not going to win, because Trump remains an extraordinarily controversial, divisive, and relatively unpopular figure. And people who have memories, a lot of them do remember the Trump years unhappily, not happily. So she can win.
I would just say
the story is her failure.
Yes, and also some other factors. I was struck in the Times Siena poll today that shows a tied race head to head, and then at one point Trump lead with the other candidates. But here in this poll as well, the issues continue to favor Trump. And so on the economy
Except
side,
abortion, right?
Except abortion, right? But economy, inflation, Harris has narrowed Trump's double-digit lead from earlier in the year, but he's still ahead. Very importantly, on immigration, he continues to have a double-digit lead. And Harris has never been able to answer the immigration issue with any substance or persuasiveness. Even in interviews with Telemundo or Univision this week, she was talking about how we did the right thing throughout the presidency, up to and including the executive measures which were imposed earlier this summer and which do seem to have contributed to a decline in illegal border crossings, just as those of us who had been supporting them from the beginning would suggest. She had this major issue. She has had nothing to say. The only issue on which she has had a sustained lead is abortion. And I think that's why she's decided on this kind of bizarre strategy of beginning the final 10 days of the campaign in Texas, a state no one thinks she's going to win, but she wants to highlight the Texas abortion restrictions, which, by the way, have been in place since September of 2022 and don't seem to have really affected the Republican Party's hold on Texas since. But nonetheless, that's what she's doing. She's going to spend these final 10 days on abortion, and Trump is Hitler.
Can I add something about the immigration debate? Because there was one, was it either during her debate with Trump or when she was being interviewed? She said, oh, of course we tried to do stuff. The administration's been doing all these things and we're not getting credit for it. It's the Republicans who blocked it. But what's been totally memory hold is that, remember that one of the first things they tried to do with Build Back Better, it included an amnesty program for people who'd come over illegally, which was not going to work. I mean, and would be highly unpopular now if you ask voters. So she can't talk about immigration because I think her true convictions, her values, as she likes to remind us, are for amnesty. They are. She has no interest in dealing with the fact that this many people have illegally crossed our border.
And can I just make one more point that actually supports what Jon is saying about her personal problems, and also what you were saying about Ron Brownstein being kind of wrong about, well, if she's losing the ad war, how can she be winning the candidate war? The ads are her. The two main ads that Trump is running right now quote her directly one on the trans surgeries for criminal illegal aliens, and the other is her appearance on The View last week saying or 2 weeks ago now, not a thing comes to mind
About
that she
Biden.
would do differently
Yeah.
from Biden. So that the ad war is her. And that seems to help Trump close the gap in the final days.
I want to sort of broaden this out. I was listening to the 538 podcast. By the way, if you look at the averages, it gets very interesting. The poll averages, which will change over the weekend. So the more Democratic leaning institutions like 538, it's not clear to me whether they've updated with the Time Siena poll yet, but have Harris winning nationally by 2. Real Clear Politics, which of course leans right, has Trump winning by 0.9 or something like that. So there is still some give in what you assign.
I just had an additional thought about my journey from Seventh-Day Adventism to Orthodox Judaism. Seventh-Day Adventism is a highly feminine religion. It's a very nurturing religion. It's one of those rare religions that was essentially founded by a woman, in this case, Ellen G. White, and that overwhelmingly feminine vibe to the religion didn't sit well. On the other hand, Orthodox Judaism is very much a patriarchal and masculine religion, and I loved that.
To different pollsters and poll averages, or how you weight them, how you grade them to favor some findings over the others. It's still a jump ball race nationally, but as Nagurny and Engelnick say in this piece, that is not good news for Harris. She needs to actually open a measurable lead up against Trump nationally.
Okay, let's get, this is Mark Halperin from Friday
The
Afternoon.
biggest political story of the day is I was in a diner in Green Bay. I spent the day in Green Bay going to diners, talking to undecided voters in Green Bay diners. And I flew back to New York. And all anybody was talking about in Green Bay was the Washington Post decision not to endorse in the presidential race. I kid. I don't think any voter really cares about this. But in elite political and media circles, is all anybody's talking about. And I see that there are some underlying issues here involving freedom of the press, Trump derangement syndrome, the woke takeover of many of our major news organizations, tradition, Jeff Bezos. There are a lot of big themes here that you could argue connect to something that the public would care about or should care about. But this is a classic story that elites care about. I really don't care that much about it. Maybe I'm not an elite. Elites care about it. It's all that's in my inbox. If you look at Twitter and journalists, and this, if it weren't a Friday, my goodness, this would go on forever. Media reporters are not always great about working Saturdays and Sundays. So it'll be all over the news in elite media circles for the next couple of days and maybe beyond. But you would think that the Washington Post did something truly profound. And for the woke people in the newsroom, it is truly profound that they're not going to endorse Kamala Harris. And really twice a day. Think about how you'll behave if your side wins, and think about how you'll behave and how you'll feel if you lose. Because there's going to be a lot of really disappointed people. Okay. Now, let's look at some stuff. This morning on Morning Joe, Jon Meacham, continuing in the great tradition of Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris and some of the now never Trumpers who worked in the administration, cast the prospect of Donald Trump winning and the what it would say about anyone who would vote for Donald Trump in terms that some might call apocalyptic. Please play number 1.
That's exactly it. You know, Vice President Harris isn't on trial here in the same way President Biden wasn't on trial when he was running. We are. The American people are on trial. And if we choose, if a sufficient number of us in a sufficient number of states choose to ignore the evidence that, as the Bible says, those with eyes to see and ears to hear can detect, then there's no, we have no excuse. We might have an explanation, which is that for a series of reasons, people are not holding the Republican Party and the nominee of that party to rational account. And I think that this is a test of citizenship in a way that certainly you'd have to go back, I think, to both the 19th century and the civil rights era to find anything equivalent. I think Gene's exactly right in that the conventional media conversation just isn't commensurate to, and hasn't been for a long time, to this election. This is not Bob Dole and George Mitchell duking it out with Bob Novak. You know, it's just, that's like talking about the Peloponnesian War, right? This just isn't that. And, you know, we can lament it, and we should, but what we really have to do, I think, is insist that if you believe in what you say you believe, and everybody we know, Willie, everybody we know believes that They're constitutionalists. They're Americans.
What kind of world does he live in? Doesn't he recognize that different people have different hero systems? Everybody we know thinks he's a constitutionalist. That's insane. Right? The Constitution is a product of a particular people. Constitution should not be a death warrant.
They believe in the country. Well, if you believe that, if that's
they believe in the country. They believe in the country in what respect? Right? The country's not going to levitate. Right? The country has good points and bad points. It has strengths and weaknesses. Right? Believe in the country. What kind of mealy-mouthed nonsense is this?
That's what you say you believe. Patriotism is not nationalism.
Yes, patriotism appeals to intellectuals more than nationalism. So from this guy's perspective, if you're a nationalist, you're a bad bloke. You're a bad person. But nationalism is the most powerful political force operating in the world for the past 250 years. And he thinks that if you are susceptible to the tug of nationalism, that you are inferior to people like him who are all about the ideas and the Constitution.
And Trump is a nationalist. Nationalism is loyalty to your own kind, right? To people who look like you, who are exactly like you.
Yes, nationalism is loyalty to your extended family. It is a normal, natural, and usually a healthy inclination. And only a tiny percentage of the population is ever going to be excited about ideas such as patriotism.
Patriotism is allegiance to an idea. The idea that, as Thomas Jefferson articulated it in the Constitution.
Right. He thinks if you're a good person, your primary allegiance is to an idea as articulated by Thomas Jefferson. Right. This reminds me growing up the son of a Christian evangelist and theologian who thought the most important thing in life was loyalty to the key evangelical Christian ideas. Right? I think the most important thing in life is how you behave and what kind of family and community you build.
Constitution has tried to actuate it, and however imperfectly, we've managed to realize just a little bit more through the years. And that's been the conversation in America. And the conversation...
That's been part of the conversation, right? That's the part of the conversation that he loves and looks up to, right? There have been all sorts of other political conversations going on in this country that are far more nationalist and racial and religious than what he's talking about here.
Could take a radical, risky, and possibly irreversible turn if we don't pay attention.
Okay,
right, that was insane.
Some of you might think he was just speaking from the heart. But boy, is that characterization of Donald Trump and Donald Trump supporters, is that going to help us get through this?
No, of course not.
I find it to be, every time I've watched it 3 times now, and every time I watch it, I wonder of all the things embedded in there. I wonder how impactful that kind of conversation is going to be, because it's not, to me, a bomb. To me, it's a bomb. All right, both Donald. There's a little bit of Don Rickles. Trump, please, number 2.
Why? Because the family came. They said that the magazine totally lied and misrepresented. This was the same magazine that said that I said about dead soldiers that there was something. What was it? Suckers and losers. Think of it. I'm supposed to be standing there over the graves of soldiers with people around me, military people or whatever, making a statement like that. Can you imagine? Can you imagine anybody doing it? I think I'd end up I may be the president, but I think somebody would start a fist fight. And probably I would say, you were right in it. Who would do this? They make up stories. It's not even like they have sources. They don't have sources. They're storytellers. They say, what would be bad? I have a bad one. And you know when it's always released? Same time with the last one. It's released just before the election. That suckers and losers story, which was totally fabricated. There's nobody that loves the military. And these were World War I heroes. They died in World War I. And I'm saying, they were suckers. I mean, you know me. They were suckers and losers. Can you imagine it? And the problem I have, Ted, is that 5, 10, 20% of people, when they read that, they're going to believe it. So I talk about it because it was a terrible thing. You know, I walked past, I remember we were doing a big event, and I was going back to Air Force One, and they were under the wing, these fake news people. They're so bad. There's a lot of them back there, by the way. We got a lot of them honoring that special person, right? We got a lot of fake news. But I remember I'm walking past, and I hear the people shouting and everything. And I heard this one voice, loud, boisterous, horrible voice, say, "Did you call the dead soldiers from World War I suckers and losers?" I said, I didn't, to myself, I said, man, that's up.
If you're going to be a public performer, it really helps if you're able to take on different personalities and use different voices. It makes you much more entertaining and interesting and compelling to pay attention to.
Bad one.
So that's Trump imitating
So
Trump.
there's another Rorschach test for you, right? Some of you I saw in the chat laughed at that. There's my president, hilarious, stream of consciousness, a little bit of the weave. And others of you watched that outraged, believe he's lying, indignant at his tone, probably didn't appreciate the way I did Trump imitating Trump. I like when he does that. But that is his mood right now, the chosen representative of how he's feeling. You think that's a guy who thinks he's losing? No. And by all accounts, he thinks he's going to win. And there are people around him who tell him he's going to win easily right now. All right. Vice President Harris, also in Texas. I'm not saying that this is a tell that trumps everything else. But one thing that happens with campaigns that feel they're behind is they see something in the news or something their opponent says, and they jump on it to make it message of the day. Bernie Sanders from the left, but some from the center, would like Kamala Harris to stop making news on anything but the economy, right? And what happens, and the classic is Dole in 96. Where is the outrage, he said. And he would get new lines based on what was in the news to try to break into the news cycle, to try to change the dynamic of the race. I don't say she's doing this as again, it's not a tell that trumps everything else. But Donald Trump said something about the U.S. being the trash can. It's all over Drudge. And the Harris campaign decided it's something she should address. So here's number 3, Vice President Harris in Texas, gaggling with her traveling press.
I also do want to address the comment that Donald Trump made about America being the trash can of the world, whatever he said, something along those lines.
The poem on the Statue of Liberty is, we welcome the wretched refuse, right? This is something that liberals used to celebrate, that America is the trash can of the world and that we welcome the wretched refuse, right? This is a poem by a Jewish communist that liberals love. It celebrates that America welcomes the wretched refuse, right? It celebrates that America is the world's trash can.
It's just another example of how he really belittles our country. This is someone who is a former president of the United States who has a bully pulpit. And this is how he uses it to tell the rest of the world that somehow the United States of America is trash. And I think, again,
President Trump and Vice President Harris, what did you see in those 3 faces?
Well, they say you never learn as much as when you lose in politics, and I'm a very well-educated political consultant. And what you see in campaigns that are losing near the end is they reduce themselves to their crystalline core. They trade breadth for intensity. They go after the most radical thing that appeals to their base. And I think what we're seeing in Meacham, who's a wonderful guy, who love and respect immensely, but what you're seeing out of the Harris campaign, he's Hitler. He's a bad, orange man bad. And, the apocalyptic vision for the country if he should win, that's going to motivate the base. Now, sometimes campaigns at the end, when they're shrinking and they've run out of doors to knock on that'll get them across the 50-yard line, make a conscious decision to reduce themselves to their 46, 47, 48% and say, we're going to beat them on the ground. We'll beat them with turnout. Our machine is better. And Democrats can do that. They basically turn a general into a midterm. But sometimes campaigns just run out of message. They run out of script, as they say in Hollywood, and then they turn to they become who they are. It's not an intentional strategy. It's all they have. And I don't know which it is for Harris, but it smells like decline.
Mark McKinnon, you have fingertips every bit as exquisitely sensitive as Alex's. What do you see in those three videos?
Well, let me. Strategies have no strategies. Napoleon, he who defends everything defends nothing. And the Trump campaign is not that campaign. The Harris campaign is wandering. I do think, though, that campaigns are different now. And I know we've talked about this before, but, if you wanted to campaign in Pennsylvania 20 years ago, you'd go to Pennsylvania. If you want to campaign in 8 battleground states now, you can go to Austin. Yeah, and you campaign everywhere because campaigns don't happen in states, they happen on our screens. And you could be down the block in Pennsylvania and not create a big enough event to actually campaign in Pennsylvania. So
good point.
I don't fault Harris for going to Beyonce in Texas. Now, why she's doing it on a Friday night, okay.
At 9:30.
McCain, Johnson, Trump, and I'm supporting Trump this time, mainly for Israel and for the. I'm extremely uncomfortable with the way the transgender issue has been handled in culture. It's like about 10 years ago, I started seeing this phrase, fact, trans women are women. And I was like, well, wait a minute, when did we decide that? And it's like the elites made this decision that this was the case. And I was like, well, I think that people who are adults should be able to do whatever they want. But I don't think that, we necessarily have to agree. I can respect somebody. I certainly have every respect in the world for Caitlyn Jenner. I'm not going to call him Bruce or anything like that. But I don't think that makes him, sorry, I did not mean to do that. That makes her a woman. I think you can have respect for people and not have to upend the whole of society.
If a state like New Hampshire, out of the blue, went Trump, or Virginia, I think probably Trump will lose Virginia, but I think it'll be closer than people think. And it might tip. I don't know about New Mexico, but I'm looking for these states here. There's a wave out there. My concern is that Trump has a ceiling. Let's see, 2016 and 2020, Trump got 48% in Pennsylvania. He won one, lost the other. He got 47% in Michigan, 2016 and 2020. Won one, lost the other. My concern is he has a ceiling. But with Kamala's kind of decline a little bit here, I think that's moving up, and I think it's putting other things in play. So I think we may get some surprises even.
Well, then, you probably have quite a good case for suing the New York Times, because you're being quoted as saying that directly. And you also, women on average are less knowledgeable than men. They're less intellectual than men.
There's lots of evidence for that. The Pew Charitable Trust, a lefty organization, released a study a few years ago that shows that women know less than men at every education level about science, about geopolitics, about geography, about, a whole host of topics. All right. That has been documented repeatedly. There's one study out of Britain that shows the only topic on which women controlling for education know more is fashion, not even art. Men know more about art. There are a lot of different, nobody has ever said that's false. Here's the counter evidence. No one has ever said that. Here's a study that shows the opposite.
Well, that ties into something else you talk about, which is the feminization of academia, but also feminization of other institutions. And is it because our institutions are so feminized that we can't talk about, let's say, whether men are cleverer than women on average?
Well, I think it certainly contributes. It is documented that women assign a lower priority to rigor and truth-telling and higher priorities to, there's survey data. This is not just one-off. There's a bunch of survey data that women assign higher priority to, sparing people's feelings, having people feel good about themselves, creating an equitable, inclusive atmosphere, and stuff along those lines. And men, on average, this is all average, of course, because there are exceptions. We understand that, or at least we should understand that, right? We're not talking about every single person. That's a straw man. Men assign higher priority to truth-seeking, to rigor, to analysis, to evidence, empiricism, and like. That's been documented. So it's not like I'm saying that without evidence. And I think that definitely affects the atmosphere in universities. When there are more women in universities, women's values and opinions start to gain the upper hand. And it is my position, and I stand by this, that the values, priorities that women favor are antithetical to the proper function of the university.
All right, Steve Saylor has a thoughtful essay here on Kamala Harris and her fixation with diversity, equity, and inclusion. Oh, man. Here we go. So, yeah, she had this video all about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Come on, where's the proper... Is there a proper link? Nope, I'll look for it. But Steve Saylor says, well, why do I bother to try to develop realistic understandings of the causes of racial and sexual statistical differences. Because if nobody tries hard, then stupid, racist, animus-driven explanations such as those from Kamala Harris will proliferate and cause all sorts of harm and wasted opportunities. Right, here is the New York
The policy
Times.
record Harris isn't talking about. This article is by Sharon Lafreniere and Julian E. Barnes and read by an automated voice. Paging through intelligence reports just weeks after she was sworn in as vice president, Kamala Harris was struck by the way two female foreign leaders were described. The reports used adjectives that, in her view, were rarely used to describe male leaders. Ms. Harris, the first woman to hold her office, ordered up a review that scrutinized multiple years of briefing reports from various intelligence agencies, looking for possible gender bias. The study found some questionable word choices, but no widespread pattern, according to a senior intelligence official, one of 5, who requested anonymity to discuss the review. None would disclose the words flagged by Ms. Harris because the reports were classified. Still, the exercise had an impact. Intelligence officials added a new training class for analysts on how to judge and assess female foreign leaders, according to another official. The episode proved to be a preview of Ms. Harris' priorities. The vice president put questions about gender and race at the center of many of the policy discussions in her office, aides and former administration officials said. Throughout her career, she pushed for policies aimed at systemic disparities and often used her bully pulpit to speak about what she saw as injustices. While Ms. Harris' allies described this as a defining feature of her vice presidency, one that separates her from her predecessors, including Democrats, she is not running on this part of her record. As she appeals to moderate voters and tries to defy Donald J. Trump's claims that she represents the radical left, Ms. Harris is emphasizing her broadest policies: abortion rights, entrepreneurship, help for home buyers, and tax relief for families with children. She rarely talks explicitly about how she would use government to address racism and sexism, and only sparingly mentions her own status as potentially the first woman, first Asian American, and first black woman to hold the presidency. She learned that if she wanted to be president of the United States, she would have to walk a very delicate, tight rope when it came to race and gender, said Leah Wright Reger, a political historian and associate professor at Johns Hopkins University, and that is exactly what we have seen from her. Yet a close examination of her tenure in Washington shows Ms. Harris' interest was steady. As vice president, she promoted an expansion of Medicaid coverage of
So, yeah, what she's primarily interested in is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And Steve Saylor notes, it's almost as if Kamala's best fit in her career would have been not as president, but as the HR lady in charge of appropriately sensitive verbiage. And this article has fun examples of Kamala fighting racism and sexism, such as giving more taxpayer money to blacks and women and taking opportunities away from whites and men. Any feminine traits of a foreign woman leader can only be praised as making her stronger and better, never as a weakness that U.S. foreign policy should be concerned about. The woman leader's country is friendly, or that the U.S. could exploit if the regime is hostile. And Steve notes there was a definite vibe shift in the HUD's news sections of the news media sometime in mid-2022, with the midterm election coming up and reports from the greater New York City area coming in that voters were alarmed by the post-George Floyd crime wave. My guess is that Joe Biden and the White House put out the word to the New York Times, Washington Post to stop doing stories praising the diversity, equity, and inclusion mania. But we never get much reporting on important questions like that, because the mainstream media doesn't think that covering how it coordinates with Democratic White Houses is news that is fit to print, while the entire Republican leading media employs about 4 investigative reporters in total. One amusing aspect of my theory is that the soft news sections of the media that cover what museums, operas, and other NGOs are up to don't seem to have ever gotten the word to lay off pushing woke hate, so they keep pushing it. All right, back to New York Times here.
Post-pregnancy care, noting the elevated health risks for Black and Native American women, as well as rural women. She lobbied for billions in funding community banks that serve disadvantaged areas and frequently lend to people of color. During the pandemic, she repeatedly asked her vice presidential staff for demographic breakdowns on COVID vaccination recipients and pressed the administration's health officials to address gaps, according to 2 former administration officials. She pushed the federal bureaucracy to incorporate concerns about equity into routine business, so much so that her advisors seldom briefed her on domestic policies without having prepared a ready answer about their impact on women, Black and Hispanic people, and other racial minorities. She was always interested in race and gender, said one former aide, who requested anonymity because of lack of authorization to speak publicly. We all knew it was really important to her.
Right, Steve Saylor follows up with a new essay, The Rise and Fall of Kamala. Kamala Harris is kind of a basic sorority ditz, but you're not supposed to admit that. Previous New York Times article about Kamala Harris reveals some embarrassingly off-narrative facts about her commitment to wokeness. This new one makes up for it by explaining that Kamala is the kindest, bravest, warmest, most wonderful human being anyone has ever known, the world according to Kamala Harris. By Robert Draper, The Rise of Kamala Harris, the tenacious child of high-achieving immigrants, is atypical, but her story is also distinctly American. The theme of this article is that Miss Harris must be more impressive than her rather thin list of accomplishments, and her ditzy sorority old girl way of thinking and speaking would suggest, because look at all the racism and sexism she must have overcome in 21st century America, but in reality it's only because she is of mixed race that she gets to take advantage of the Democratic Party's need to nominate a black, slightly black woman. Right? There's no there with Kamala Harris. Right? She's risen all the way to being the boss of Tim Walz, who was once a high school assistant football coach. You can't get more extraordinary than that. So what impact has Kamala Harris made? What are Kamala's intellectual interests? Right? I'm drawing a complete blank on that question. Usually the mainstream media is quick to explain that Democratic candidates such as Barack Obama and Bill Clinton aren't just ward-healing politicians, but they are deeply, sincerely fascinated by highbrow theories. But nobody seems interested in explaining what books, if any, are read by Kamala Harris. Kamala was popular at Howard University. She rushed the top sorority, but she did not distinguish herself academically. Right, she got into a law school, Hastings Law School, that was ranked 82nd in the country, and she got in through a program of affirmative action. Right, Kamala may seem pleasant, but she's not exactly an interesting, insightful, or intelligent woman. She's made quite a career out of her part black ancestry. If I were to make a list of why Kamala ought to be president, says Steve Saylor, that she was subjected to Willie Brown's political pillow talk would rank high on her list, but that she has not been sleeping with Willie for 30 years is worrisome. So Kamala appealed to San Francisco rich people, and she is really good at raising money. And nothing particularly awe-inspiring or impressive has she ever accomplished. Right, Kamala's always had an inflated self-image of herself as presidential timber, but people who've known her recognize that she is a bore. Right, taking an interest in politics would seem like a low bar for anybody running for president, but Kamala can't seem to pay the requisite attention to the news. She's like Michelle Obama in that she's not interested in public affairs. Right, Kamala is a prettier lady than Michelle Obama, and Kamala is probably best suited to marrying an ambitious man and serving as a popular society hostess in a San Francisco power couple, but she failed to land a husband until she was 49. So her failure to start a family of her own seems like a defining shortcoming of her life. She seems to enjoy having been a stepmother of grown children. She seems to be a doting aunt. She likes cooking. Now, why couldn't she catch a husband until she was too old for children? Seems like an interesting question. She probably focused on landing a black man and a high achiever who are in short supply in the Bay Area. Her eventual husband, Doug Emhoff, is a white Jewish Century City lawyer, and marrying him required that she had to move to Brentwood in Southern California. Kamala is a lot like Michelle Obama, except Michelle Obama didn't bother to run for office. If Kamala Harris weren't so discriminated against due to her race and sex, what would she be by now? Galactic overlord? Isn't it more plausible that her career has benefited absurdly by her being a woman and about 1/4 black? So Kamala is a basic woman. She's only gotten so far in her career due to America's strong favoritism during her lifetime in favor of presentable people who can muster some claim to be African American, even a claim as tenuous as Kamala's ancestry of half Tamil Brahmin and half from the mixed race Jamaican bourgeoisie.
And as a woman yourself, you probably should have the sort of protected characteristic to be able to say such things.
Accusations against me, the awful things I've said that form the basis for my behavioral violations. Of course, that's just sophistry. That's speech and opinion. They just slap a different label on it, and no one challenges them. But most of what I've said is clearly true. So the fact that it's true doesn't matter. That's irrelevant. What's relevant is that it's inequitably targeted disrespect, whatever the hell that is. That's a made-up phrase that my university came up with to characterize my infractions. Inequitably targeted disrespect. Of course, there's inequitably targeted disrespect is everywhere, as you know. But for example, one of my infractions was saying in a discussion, an academic discussion somewhere, that on average blacks have lower cognitive ability than whites. Well, they do. That's been documented maybe 100 times, and there's no study to the contrary. It's an unfortunate fact, but it's a fact. The American Psychological Association has twice officially stated that that is a valid statement. All right, that is a valid statement. So, the fact that it's true doesn't save me. You're not supposed to say that. You're not supposed to say that, women are less knowledgeable than men. You're not supposed to make any statement that makes people feel bad about themselves, whether or not it represents reality, whether or not it's true. You're not supposed to say that, the black out of wedlock birth rate is 73%, which is an undeniable fact. That makes people feel bad. I could go on and on. I could go on and on of the kinds of statements that blacks have higher rates of crime, and especially violent crime.
Why is it that the culture that means that you can't say these things is feminine? I mean, why is it not that it's infantile or frightened or kind of? Is it particularly feminine that culture?
Well, I mean, it's both feminine and infantile. Because as I've said, those proscriptions, the inability to deal with the data and then move on from the data. The data doesn't prove anything about what, policies we should have, about how we should deal with such a thing. It's just the beginning of the discussion, right? The beginning of what, could be a very interesting and nuanced discussion, actually. But I've said that, the feminization of standards and practices brings into the academy the rules of the nursery and the kindergarten. The rules of the nursery and the kindergarten are, we have to encourage everyone, tell everyone how amazing they are, never say anything negative or critical, never make anybody feel bad about themselves. It's the warm bath theory of education, basically. And, but that somehow is the way to get people to learn. I frankly don't think it's the way to get people to learn. I think there is a role for encouraging people, for supporting people, but it can't be the all of it, because sometimes you have to tell people things they don't want to hear.
Okay, here is an Emporia Magazine podcast on depictions of sex in popular media.
Remember, you can listen to. If you wanted to design just like the most fun things you could talk podcast, our guest today is Catherine Salmon, my longtime colleague and evolutionary psychologist, professor at Redlands University, who has a very, very interesting and entertaining research. If you wanted to design just like the most fun things you could talk about at parties, I think that's what your research often entails. Is that what you're motivated by, like socializing?
Really to entertain myself, probably more than anything else. But yes, it can make for interesting party conversations, interesting conversations with trustees at university parties. Definitely fun.
So what is the formula for a romance novel? That segues us perfect.
Oh, well, I think there are a number of things that are like, I don't know, what I might call essential features, right? Like, I mean, it really focuses on relationship, commitment, love. There's got to be some barrier that keeps people apart. I don't think it's actually that complicated.
That segues us perfect.
I think historically it's often involved, what I would consider high mate value men, right? If you're thinking about a traditional heterosexual romance, you've got men who would be considered desirable from our field's kind of standard, either having resources with the ability to acquire resources, and generally speaking, younger women, right, has been the formula.
Yeah, I've only read one romance novel because I was really interested in them in my book and I was writing. So it's called A Devil in Winter, and it's about a young woman who has a stutter, who like nobody notices her because she's one of the wallflowers, so she's a very shy young woman. And in order to inherit her father's estate, because her father is about to die or something, and keep it from her evil whatever uncle, she has to get married. And so she marries this guy who's an heir to a fortune, but he's a rake. You know, he's always drunk and he's carousing, and I think he tried to literally rape her friend. Something happened like that, and they get married within the first like 20 pages.
Right.
So, but then it's supposed to be just a marriage of convenience, and they're not supposed to actually be in love. But he's very competent and very kind to her. And in the book, I've never heard so many descriptions of like feeling cold and then getting warm. So like on this carriage ride, because they have to take a carriage all the way to Scotland from London, because Scotland was where you used to elope back in the whatever 1800s. He keeps like a warm rock at her feet, or he always makes sure that she's warm enough. And so the whole relationship, I don't know if that's a common trope in romance novels. It's like somebody keeping you warm. I don't know.
Sometimes like you have these bizarre ones where like, you know, they're trapped somewhere, right? And it's all about protecting the other person. And that can be an excuse to sleep together, right? You got to share body warmth. So there can be a little bit of that, but that sort of, I mean, it has that very historical kind of romance flair to it, it sounds like, where, you know, exotic location. You think
well, the last thing I'll say is, so she says they sleep together one time so that they consummate, so that, that their relationship is legible to the law or whatever. But then she's like, I won't sleep with you again because you're a rake and you're out with these other women all the time. So she makes him be monogamous for 3 months. And then he is monogamous for her because he loves her so much, of course. But then he gets shot. Sorry if anybody's going to read this. He gets shot. So then I think at that point, he's like, not just beholden to her, but like he.
All right. So the host here is Diana Fleischman, evolutionary psychologist, talking to Catherine Salmon.
Actually can't run around like he used to. And so in some ways he's both monogamous and then he's also injured in such a way that he must be monogamous to her. So it's a little bit of, Clockwork Orange, like there's some physical limitation to him.
It seems like an unusual way of sort of taming the hero that you typically see in a romance novel. But yeah, I mean, that's when you think about it that way, that's been such a huge part of the romance novel genre, is like the whole long-term mating.
I remember I broke my wrist playing football, and it increased the desire of this woman I was seeing to sleep with me.
Sort of scenario, right? And getting the guy to behave the way that you want him to. So,
yeah, and the jealousy and the other interlopers and all that kind of stuff. Isn't it a common thing in romance novels and / fiction, we'll talk about later, for people to be wounded or injured, right? And for people to care for other people.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's part of if you have somebody or character who's often not vulnerable, it's a way to make them vulnerable and make them need the other person in different ways. I think that is often used as a vehicle to get them where you want them to go, right? If you think about what do you need to do to get characters to get together, that can definitely be one that you see. I think you probably even see it more in like things like / fiction than you do in traditional heterosexual romance, just because there often may be other things that you need to do to get them together that maybe above and beyond what you might see in a regular romance novel. But definitely, I think you see that, where especially if it's the guy that's injured, right, in a heterosexual romance or / it could be either of the guys, but I think that it definitely is a way to show vulnerability and then the other person's ability to take care of them. And then also it's a chance for people to recognize how attached they are, right? If somebody's been badly injured and there's a risk you could lose them, then, that can be a big impetus to pushing up.
Yeah, and also if you're taking care of somebody when they have low social value, that's the kind of vehicle for gratitude, but it also is like kind of a way of getting a partner at a discount. If you take care of somebody like when they're on the low, like when they're undervalued in the market.
Sure. I suppose that's a big part of it, for sure.
Okay, so one thing that you've written about is the difference between two different fictional worlds. And you've also written, interestingly, you have a new paper out that you're a co-author on about what we can learn about human evolved psychology and learning based on fictional stories. But what is Romantopia and what is porntopia, and what are the differences between the two?
Okay, so like Romantopia, and God, it's been years since Thought Science and I first wrote about this, but Romantopia is like this idealized, fantasy world that is created for women in romance novels, right? This is a world in which, it's about it's about long-term mating. It's about, what are the features of the hero, right, that are appealing in a long-term romance. It's about the journey to get there. It's about commitment. It's about sex that's costly as opposed to sex that's cheap, which in a sense is the contrast, right, to pornotopia, where pornotopia is the genre of, or the fantasy world that we see in pornography, where it is about short-term mating, and it is about women who are not expensive to get to have relationships with you, right? It's about women who are always, willing and beautiful and young and are not going to demand a lot of you before consenting to sexual relationships. So, I mean, the big differences, I think, between them are the long-term versus short-term focus. I mean, I think they often, both are about first encounters often, right? Romance novels tend to be about couples getting together for the first time, even if it's a long-term focus. Whereas Romantopia is often about short-term and together for the first time, and then together for the first time. That I would consider creep. People's appetite and then make it easier for people to lose weight.
All right, this is fascinating. This is her theory on eating disorders among young women.
Whether that's going to enable some problems for that, but my sort of thoughts on disordered eating, in particular on the sort of restrictive eating, is that the kinds of things that tend to exacerbate it are things that are related to female competition. And so whatever ramps up female competition is likely to ramp up things like disordered eating, because, or at least, my theory, and not everybody shares the exact same.
So disordered eating, restrictive eating, very rare in Orthodox Jewish day schools. I suspect that for many reasons, the female competition there is at a much lower level than in secular life.
Theories about what's driving the mechanism for eating disorders, but that in general, that stress, however it is being sort of recognized by the body, is one of the things that is causing this disordered eating or this restrictive eating. So, for example, a few years ago, actually a number of years ago now, I published a paper that looked at different types of stressors and how different kinds of stressors were influencing women's disordered eating. And the stressor that was having the biggest effect wasn't anything like, men or unwanted attention from men, but it was how much female competition they perceived to be in their environment, right? So if you expose them to images of beautiful women, they get more stressed out, they feel worse about themselves, they have more disordered eating. If they perceive their environment as being one of just high female competition, even if it's social competition, that tends to stress them out and be connected to more disordered eating. It's most problematic, we found anyways, historically, most problematic in young women. And in general, it does go down with age, which is why some people, it's almost like they age out of it or they grow out of it in a sense, right? That things change in their life and they have less problematic eating behavior. And for many women, also getting deciding to have children changes that too, because you can't get pregnant if you're really low weight. And so they go through all these changes to make themselves healthy in a way that they can have a child. And then some women will drift back to it and some women don't afterwards. And so what we found is that generally, the risk went down with age, although there's some indication that some postmenopausal women are experiencing elevated levels of female competition when they find themselves newly single. That may be ramping up that behavior as well. We just published a study looking at this in Adaptive Human Behavior and Physiology. So to me, I think the online thing that you mentioned is a big problem, right? Because what are you getting exposed to?
Yeah, it seems like to me there's been like some creep in what's considered disordered eating. So like I think in the 90s and early 2000s, disordered eating was straightforwardly like, are you taking laxatives? Are you throwing up? Or are you have a BMI under 17? I think. But like now there's like orthorexia, or like there's ideas about like are you ritualizing eating? So I think that we've expanded what's considered disordered eating because obesity is such a common problem, and now people think, well, the normal way you eat is the way that is the majority of the population is eating, and what's abnormal is actually sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, I mean, I think even when I use the term like disordered eating, I mean, there's a lot of eating that can be disordered that is not of the kind that leads to low body weight, which is the kind that I've studied, right? I would argue that many Americans engage in disordered eating behavior that was also the exact opposite problem of weighing too much. There's also the exercise anorexia that people will talk about sometimes, where people it's excessive exercising to the point that they also are keeping their BMI really low, they're not menstruating, whatever. And so, I mean, when I study it, there's relatively few people in my samples that would be considered clinical, because I don't go out and recruit clinical samples. I'm usually looking at the general population. But there's always a handful that would, I think, meet the clinical definition. And I don't, so when the measures that I'm using are usually the ones, because I've tended to keep using the same ones over time, modern media. Now we have students who go to schools where they're thrown in with like 1,000 kids the same age that are their competitors instead of the 100 people in their village. And they have all of these images of people on the media. And so I think it skews our perception of our own, attractiveness and where we fall on the scale of things in terms of what's considered an average appearance, to the point that it's going to make a lot of things problematic. And I would even take that back to the gender dysphoria thing, which I don't know, maybe this is going to be controversial or not, I don't know. But, if what you see out there is an image of what a perfect person is supposed to be like, or what an ideal person is going to be like, and you don't fit it, then you think you must be something else. I mean, I was a total tomboy growing up. I liked to play in the dirt. I liked to collect bugs. I liked to climb trees. I did it in a skirt and no shoes. By current standards, somebody would say, well, you don't really fit the typical girl. Maybe you were supposed to be a boy. And I don't think that I was. And I think, I worry sometimes about that some of this is that we see what we think this is the ideal, and forget that there's a range within each sex, right? Of how prototypically feminine or masculine you are. And before you hit puberty, and until a few years after you're done with puberty, those things are highly variable, right? I mean, for me, puberty made a huge change, and not necessarily in some of the stuff. I still love pro wrestling and climbing trees, but I also like lots of girly stuff now. As you can tell, my room is pink behind me. I painted my office pink. So I think about those kinds of things, and I have a really close friend who is lesbian, and she finds some of the things that she sees today really concerning, because she's a very masculine lesbian, and she thinks that she would have been treated very differently when she was young and she was growing up today, and she doesn't think that would have been a benefit to her. She's happy with the way she is. And so I think whether it's eating disorders or other things, I think a lot of what we see held up as an ideal doesn't mean that there isn't variation, and we often don't focus very much on that variation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating that disordered eating and the rise of trans identity comes out of female competition. Right, looking at my bookmarks on X, there are thousands of memes, dozens of videos highlighting Kamala's apparent substance problem, and her campaign thinks it's a good idea for her to sit down at a bar and drink. Post here by The Rabbit Hole. Kamala is a DEI hire. It's got quotes here. Joe Biden. Whomever I pick, preferably be someone who was of color and or a different gender. I commit that I will in fact pick a woman to be vice president. I know what a black job is. It's vice president of the United States. And Nate Hockman says, this is a wild New York Times piece. They're essentially admitting point blank that the only thing Kamala Harris really cares about is race, and that she was obsessed with forcing equity into every aspect of the federal government. Jeffrey Tucker says, I paid far more attention to Kamala than I ever imagined I would with a presidential candidate. I suspect that many people, even people who are her partisans, are realizing something shocking. She knows less about policy, news, existing controversies, and even recent history than most people who read X or the New York Times or just listen to the news on the radio or TV. It's as though she hasn't paid much attention to anything for years. Interviewers are trying their best to be kind to her, but even the slightest bit of push on what she knows turns up a big nothing. It's not that she's being cagey or clever. The trouble is she truly does not know. It's hard to understand why. She's always been just a smiling face, the socializer, the spouter of bromides, and she's gotten away with faking it. After a while, it probably doesn't feel like faking it. It just feels like this is the way this job is supposed to be. Now she is expected to play the part of someone who knows something minimal about a range of issues, and she simply cannot deal with it. What's remarkable is that her champions are as mortified by this as anyone. And here's Richard Hanania talking about Chris Brunet. What's going on with Chris is interesting. He's now breaking with mainstream conservatism and denouncing the Israeli war in Gaza. As a writer, there are two audiences you can appeal to, philo-Semites and anti-Semites. The philo-Semites control established media institutions and think tanks. If you want a career there, you have to be pro-Israel. This is the only way you'll have anything to do with the New York Post, Fox, Manhattan Institute. There are incentives pushing in the other direction. If you want to be completely independent, there's a huge market for anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic content. Most of the influencers there are very dumb, so if you're smart at all, you can be a big fish in a small pond. Though intelligence might be a hindrance when appealing to this low IQ crowd. The anti-Semitic crowd is composed of those who talk about demons and Christ is king, anti-vaxxers, and conspiracy theorists. They think Dugan is the world's greatest living intellectual. They believe that North Korea's slave society is some things worth emulating. They don't have any institutions because they're dysfunctional people shunned by society. They think this is because the Jews oppress them. Mostly it's their own failures. While you won't get hired by a Groyper think tank, you can have a huge following on social media because appealing to such people, there are a lot of them. Candace Owens is the prototype of this model. So Chris Brunet is throwing his lot in with low human capital. Picking Gaza only makes sense in terms of psychology or financial interest. It's a wrong path. Gets you a lot of attention and can make you a lot of money. Israel's the right cause on merit, says Richard Hanania. Right, back to my essay on common lies that Americans tell. And I think these are 20 common lies that are probably international. I'm fine, nothing's wrong. I was stuck in traffic. You look great in that article of clothing. I only had one beer. My phone died. I had no way to contact you. I never got the message. I'll call you right back. Didn't cost that much. It was on sale. Oh, this old thing, I've had it for ages. I'm on the way. Thanks, it's just what I've always wanted. You've lost weight. You haven't changed a bit. I didn't touch it. I have no idea where it is. I'll try to make it. I have a headache. I would never lie to you. And from my post on Australians are perhaps Australian men are the world's laziest daters. All right, 10 signs you're dating an Aussie guy. One video, anniversaries are low key. Aussies prefer less material gifts. You're not going to get long, serious conversations without a lot of irreverence. Tall poppy syndrome, you cut down people who try to appear taller than others. Aussies would rather be seen as bogan, working class, rather than preppy or snobby. Aussies like seeming average. Australian working class men take great pride that their partner stays home. Aussie guys say how it is. They don't sugarcoat. It's important that you get along with their family and friends. Aussie men are casual daters, don't expect a lot of formal dinners going out to the movies. Aussies don't usually feel the need to define the relationship. When you're in a relationship, you'll be called the guy's missus, even if you're not married. And Aussies tend to be environmentally conscious. So I like the bit here about being someone's missus.
So the idea that if somebody's growing taller than the others, they're all going to chop them down back to where they should be. Keep in line, keep the status quo. There is something about Aussie men who almost go above and beyond to seem like they're just the normal average bloke. They don't want to be seen as stuffy or pretentious or snobbish. They'd almost rather be seen as bogan than preppy or snobby. So if you're on a date with an Aussie guy, you're not going to hear them bragging about the places they've traveled to, name dropping celebrities that they might have met. They're not going to be talking about what they make or what their credit score is. Yes, I've actually had an American who pulled up his credit score. A big thing in Australian culture. Australian men in particular are not the type to really overly brag about that sort of thing. Overall, Aussie men are not really into status. Now, this was something I didn't really notice until I moved over here and I started meeting Mark's friends and I started working in different offices. I've had 2 different jobs while I was over here, and something about Aussie men in particular, there's a sense of pride if their partner is a stay-at-home mom or a housewife. And I think this is kind of a mixed bag all in all. Over here in Australia, there is paid maternity leave. There are more government benefits to being a parent over here in Australia than there are in the States. So this is something that wasn't really talked about, and overall, I think it just wasn't really that common over in the States. Over here, it's really not uncommon for people to take a year or even 5 years up until their kids are going into primary school to just...
Okay, back to this blog post. Some general observations. Australians tend to find American culture uptight and overly strict. Australian culture is more sexually segregated. American women tend to be more aggressive with men than Australian women. Americans find Australians too comfortable and too at ease with other people. Family and friends are more important to Aussies. Americans, from an Australian perspective, seem more legalistic, individualist, and ambitious. Australians impute less meaning to their work. Australians are less interested in status, and they are less likely to boast. Reverse culture shock. returning to America after moving to Australia. Australians don't tip. American service used to be far better than it was in Australia, perhaps not so much anymore. Americans place far more importance on work. Shops shut earlier in Australia. All Aussies get a minimum of 4 weeks holiday a year. This one Aussie girl says, I felt like I was too friendly in the South, just too at ease with other people. American guy says, in America at a party, couples stick together, while in Australia, guys go with guys, women with women. Americans find a dramatic loss of convenience when they move to Australia. American states are far more varied and different from each other than Australian states. There are far fewer healthy food options in Australia. Having friendly chats with strangers is more common and less risky in Australia. You'll generally feel safer in Australia. And in American cities, you often have the stench of marijuana, while that is quite rare in Australia.
I remember years ago advising a minority student who was in one of my classes, a good student, very curious, very serious. And when he/she wrote a paper for me, I'm trying to anonymize this person, it was really poorly written, quite bad. And I said to the person, you know, you are not a good writer. You're a terrible writer. And that is going to hold you back as a lawyer. That is going to haunt you in your attempt to get ahead. And you need to face up to it. And you need to work. You need to just start from scratch, work your butt off to improve your writing. Okay, I don't care whether it's fair or just or why this happened or whatever. Like, forget the blame game. Just go forward. And you're going to have to work really hard. And I actually sat down with the person and I blue penciled their paper. I tried to show them where the problems were. That's very time consuming. And nowadays, like, you wouldn't bother because, they probably complain about you and how you were discriminating against them. I mean, one of my former students told me that in her law firm, when a Black young woman student associate was brought on the carpet for inadequate work, she just said, well, that's racism. That the only reason you're saying that is because of racism. That's the answer to everything.
Mm. And I've seen videos of you where you are,
Okay, so what's the significance of Israel's attack on Iran? This is Michael Oren, the author, former Israeli ambassador. Military terms, Israel's retaliation against Iran on Saturday morning was a prodigious success, demonstrated the unparalleled prowess and regional reach of the Israeli Air Force and its ability to operate in Iranian skies with total impunity. The strike again showcased the success of Israeli intelligence in penetrating the highest echelons of Iran's military and civilian leadership and in pinpointing diverse and remote targets. Israel's defense forces, though deeply engaged in both Gaza and Lebanon, proved its ability to operate on yet another major front, and the attack minimized civilian casualties. Though impressive, the military feats were at least equaled, if not surpassed, by Israel's political, diplomatic, and strategic achievements, because the raid followed weeks of intense pressure on Israel from the Biden administration, which adamantly opposed an Israeli strike against Iran's nuclear and oil facilities. The White House got its way. So in addition to pleasing Washington, the raid was favorably received by Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Jordan, and Egypt. All want Iran punished, but not at the price of an all-out Middle East war. Iran's Russia allies suffered a major setback as its most sophisticated anti-aircraft systems were shown to be powerless to stop the Israelis. So will this Israeli attack dampen Iranian support for its terrorist proxies and lead to diplomatic solutions? Or did the limited operation reduce or enhance the danger of an Iranian decision to break out and create a nuclear weapon?
The pilots last night, and we're talking about probably somewhere around a third to a half of the Israeli Air Force was deployed last night, from what I understand. And they stayed up in the air for hours and hours on end, carrying out 3 waves of strikes. And they did so with deadly efficiency, and they all came home and had breakfast with their families. That is a remarkable feat in and of itself.
All right, this is the Call Me Back podcast. It's essential if you're interested in this topic.
Of responses considered. The first one would be heavy-duty hits against Iranian energy, symbols of government, and possibly even nuclear installations. This was taken almost immediately off the table. It wasn't only that the US administration was pressuring Israel not to do that, it was also about effectiveness, and it was about Israel not wanting this to devolve into a full-fledged regional war. A second option was to have another sort of very targeted, slim attack against Iran. This was again ruled out because this time, and this is something we have said on your show, the general consensus within the Israeli defense apparatus and within the Israeli government is that this time it's not only the regime that needs to understand what has happened, but also the people of the Islamic Republic need to know for themselves that Israel has hit Iran, and that this needs to be an effective strike in the mean that it will actually produce some results that will assist Israel if this again will escalate and if Israel will find itself.
All right, here is an argument on Israel Update, GADI Tau, Mike Durant.
Balance in the region. And then there is a third faction saying, this is just a first wave. This is just a beginning. And as supporting evidence, that faction brings the fact that Israel neutralized a lot of air defenses, which looks like a preparation for something that may be larger. So what do you think it is? What of the three options do you find convincing, Mike?
Of the three that you just mentioned, I'm much closer to the third one, that I think this needs to be seen as a step in a process. And I think that it was, I do think that the Israelis adhered to the American red lines, but I think that within those red lines, they managed to deliver a pretty serious blow to the Iranians. The Iranians were trying to make light of what happened, say, oh, nothing really, the Israelis are lying, they didn't do much, et cetera, which is kind of expected. You don't automatically do that in war. You always downplay what your enemy has done. But I think today they woke up with a broken nose. Put it that way. If we put it in boxing terms, they still have their arms, they still have their legs, they can still see, but they got their nose broken, and boy, does it hurt. I think it hurts a lot more. Let's also stipulate here, GADI, that we still don't know a lot. We're waiting to see the satellite photographs and the briefings. I'm sure the Israelis, well-informed Israelis, will tell us more about exactly what was done. But I think that this was a very significant blow. Tactically, it wasn't a strategic change, but tactically a significant blow. And I would not be disappointed by any stretch of the imagination.
But so you sound like the first option. Can we take the win and go home?
Well, I don't think you can take the win and go home because there's so much else going on. It's not like the war just ends as a result of this. There's a war in Gaza, there's a war in Lebanon, and there's a conflict with Iran more broadly. So I don't think this brings us that much closer to an end.
But I'll tell you what's the worrying thing. The clock. We are how many days? 12 days off for the American elections, and after that, everything will be far more difficult. There's a limit to the abrasiveness of the limits of abrasiveness with which the administration can treat Israel before an election. It would be much freer to do much more after the election. And if you look at the trajectory, Israel has a large strategic goal and then a very precise goal within it. There is a serious danger, a serious and immediate danger if this regime acquires nuclear weapons. There would not be a better chance, asterisk, unless Trump wins, there would not be a better chance to strike at the nuclear facilities. And therefore, one asks oneself, have we just missed the historic chance to take out their nuclear capabilities?
If you see me smiling here, it's because of my dumbest take on the news. Can I just run to my dumbest take news right now because it's directly related to what you're saying?
I don't know. It's the dumbest take on the news. Is that what you just said?
A country of 9 million people. It's very dependent on the United States. This administration is absolutely against it. Everyone else in the world is against it. It doesn't make sense to go. And Israel doesn't have the capability to take out probably all of Iran's nuclear facility. So it doesn't make sense to do it right now.
No country has the ability to take out all of Iran's nuclear facilities, right? If Iran wants a nuclear weapon, right, it cannot be stopped.
I find it hard to dispute that because I don't know the operational details of what exactly we can and cannot do. But what you just said make the hair on the back of my neck. I have hair in the back, you can't see it. Stand because, and I feel it viscerally. there will be a moment where they would be close enough to a nuclear device where we will go apeshit, Mike, regardless of the price. I'm not sure that you sitting in Washington even understand what Israelis viscerally feel at this moment. But if we are going to face another Holocaust, we are going, I am sure, I don't have the red buttons on my desk, but expect the unexpected. We surprise the world with beepers and gadgets, but this is not going to be on the same scale if the sword is on our neck. I wonder if these people in Washington who are calculating war games according to game theory even understand what the Jews of Israel will feel like if they feel they face another Holocaust.
I think that I'm not disputing that. I have every belief that Israel is going to do everything it can to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. But I think that the Israelis will also be very, very smart in calculating. I'm talking about the leadership and the way they go about it. Look at what Israel's done here. Let's forget about. Let's put the nuclear question into the distance here for a little bit. They just took out all of Iran's air component of solid propellant rockets and missiles, which is very interesting what they did, because these are the ones that Iran shot against Israel last time on October 1. The reason that solid fuel is important is that it drastically reduces the launch cycle, so that if you're watching Iran and you want to have early warning that they're about to shoot missiles, you don't have much time to react. And so what they've done is they have taken away the ability of Iran to produce these weapons. They've figured out precisely where the choke points are in the production of these missiles, and they have taken that capability away from the Iranians.
Okay, let's